The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line.
Okay, guys, this is a copy, my copy, of the webinar that was put on yesterday, September 28, 2016, by Kevin Morris from the FAA's safety team. And there's a lot of good information here. Just remember, Part 107 itself is the actual rule. And when this webinar starts, you'll see some comments in the chat box on the bottom right. Some of that information is a little bit conflicting from what you hear Kevin talk about. Kevin is pretty much spot on, though, so I would kind of don't give too much credence to what you see going on in the chat box. And later on, Kevin, the next day, Kevin did go back and answer the questions that were asked and put them in a PDF format, and I will include a link in the description of the video for that. So sit back and enjoy it, and hope you get some good information out of it. And again, please thank Kevin Morris for putting this out and taking the time to help us out.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. It's about 6:01 p.m. Central Time here in the great state of Minnesota. Welcome to Commercial UAS Operations under Part 107. My name is Kevin Morris, and I will be presenting this evening's in-depth discussion here regarding the regulations, certification, and commercial operations for unmanned aircraft, according to the newly released FAA regulations. One of the things I'm going to do right away is make sure that the recording here is started. I am going to record this seminar webinar, and my hope is to then be able to upload it later and have you folks dial in and watch it at your leisure. Or many people have asked that they would have it recorded because they're not going to be here this evening, and so that is something too I'd like to be able to publish for everyone to see. However, no guarantees on that right now. For some odd reason, we just quite haven't done that yet with our Citrix license. So that's my goal. We'll see if it can happen here. I'm going to let the webinar kind of hold here for a couple of minutes, let everybody log in, and then we'll get started with the presentation here in about 2 minutes. Okay, well, here we go. Hopefully this works out for everyone. We have a lot of questions rolling in already, as to be expected. We did have just over 900 people register for tonight's webinar. Currently, we're up to about 500 people that have, maybe 550 people that have connected, and we'll do our best here to get through everyone's questions. I know they're going to be coming fast and furious, and there is just no possible way that we're going to be able to answer everyone's questions. So right from the beginning, before I get into the introductions, I'd like to say, if you have a question, please, by all means, send it in through the questions dialog box, and I'll explain that here in a little bit. If we don't get to it right now on the webinar, we will answer every question, and if a lot of questions are the same, we'll group them into one answer. and that roundup, the recap, will be emailed to everyone that has registered for tonight's webinar. So don't feel lost or left out if you don't get your question answered right away. I promise you we will get to it as we move forward here. Going through the slides here, a little bit of an overview of what we plan to accomplish tonight. This is, like I mentioned earlier, a little bit of a lengthy presentation, and my idea is to move through it as quickly but efficiently as possible. So we're going to cover a little bit of a welcome, a quick intro to Citrix webinar, a brief history of how we got here in terms of UAS, commercial UAS operation. I'm going to go over some myths and facts, the remote pilot certificate, and then spend most of our time talking about the next two bullet points, one which is 14 CFR Part 107, and the next one after that is going to be waivers and authorizations. I probably get more questions on those two bullet points than anything else combined. We will cover some web-based resources for UAS pilots, stuff that manned pilots have known for a while that translate very well to unmanned aircraft operation. Go through a few real-world scenarios, and then at the end, what we'll do is we'll open up the question and answer session. And if you've dialed in, you're doing over the telephone or you're doing it through your computer, I will try and attempt to have you be able to answer the question verbally rather than type it in. Again, with maybe 600-700 people in attendance tonight, we literally can't get to everyone. But if we didn't get to your question or you had a hand raised or something, please type it in the question box and we will get to that question. We will email everybody the responses so everybody's on the same page. So a huge welcome. Thank you for being here. One of the things that I'm very excited about is unmanned aircraft operations. Currently, the last numbers I checked, unmanned aircraft system registrations outnumber manned aircraft registrations 2 to 1. And that's pretty impressive considering I think the registration portal has only been open for about 10 or 11 months. So when we're looking at the future of aircraft operations, it's hard to say that it's not UAS. So thank you for being here. Thank you for taking time to learn the system, because we've finally done our part at the FAA. We've published Part 107. It's now in your hands, the operator. You folks out there conducting operations, running your business to ensure that this goes smoothly as we move forward. Big piece of that's education, why you guys are here, why I'm spending time at night doing this with you guys. So thank you again for joining. A little bit about me, that's considerably younger me with a lot darker hair, but back in the day, that's what I did. I drove airplanes around for an airline. I hold an airline transport pilot certificate. I'm a certified flight instructor. I also hold a remote pilot certificate. Obviously, I'm an FAA aviation safety inspector, and I manage the Minneapolis FSDO FAAST team. And I've been the point of contact for UAS in the office now for coming up on 4 years. So I've got a pretty solid background on the regulatory side of UAS. Because I don't pretend to know everything, I've got a couple other people that are helping me out. Jay Flowers, who is down in Oklahoma City right now, is actually the Fargo FSDO FAAST team program manager. He's been doing that for a while. He's actually one of the individuals that trained me in. And Jay, you want to pop on and say hi real quick?
Hey, how you guys doing?
All right. So there's Jay. Jay is going to be running it from the production side. So you guys furiously typing in questions, I can see scrolling up on this side of my screen here. Jay is managing that. And what he's going to do is, if there's a question that's pertinent, that's a good question we need to have answered, he's going to jump in, interrupt me, and I will answer that question right away. Other than that, he's going to direct questions as needed. The other individual we have is one of my safety representatives. He's a volunteer from industry. He's a commercial U.S. operator. One of the founders of Mad Meetup, that is Aaron Sykes. Aaron, you want to say hello? All right, so there's Aaron. Aaron is going to join us. He's going to be on board to answer questions that relate directly to operating a UAS, the actual operation of it, or conducting business, the business end of it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to tell you guys that I know or I'm a great UAS pilot or that I know how to start up a business. That's not my area of expertise, but certainly it's Aaron. So we do have a couple people here that are going to be running the production side, can help you out in the background. If you guys look, we have some handouts. If you look at your what they call the grab tab, and I'll explain that in a minute, we have 5 handouts available to you. I recommend you guys download them all. They should all be in PDF format. Advisory Circular 107-2 does a fantastic job of explaining a lot of Part 107. There's also a summary of the rule. a legal interpretation that we put out for educational institutions and whether or not they cross the line into Part 107 or could they still be considered hobby. That's a great read if you're involved in an educational institution. Also the performance-based standards, which we'll cover in detail, but I included the document here for download, and then some instructions on Airspace and Waiver authorization. So some basics about the GoToWebinar. Apologies if you guys are all pros at this, but we got to make sure that everybody understands how the system works. The control panel that you see on the screen there, that's how you interact with myself or Jay. Right now everybody's on mute, and if I did it right, you won't be able to unmute yourself. I'm going to keep it that way until we get to the question session, but certainly you could answer questions. The grab tab, which you see there, you can use the orange arrow to hide it if you want to free up some screen real estate. There's also, again, that mute and unmute. However, I've kind of overridden everyone's mute, so you guys are all stuck on mute until I let you come off. And then the blue box there, that allows you to view the webinar full screen. And then the other one, which we're going to use a few different times tonight, even if you don't have a question, and that's the raise the hand feature. I'm going to ask a couple times, by show of hands, what I can see and what you guys can't really see, but I can see a percentage of hands raised. So I'm going to say by show of hands, and then I'll ask you guys a question, especially when we get into the scenarios. But when we do get into the Q&A at the very end, that'll be a great tool for you to raise your hand, and we'll try to get to everybody. We certainly won't be able to do it. Make sure you type your question in the box if you're not going to get it answered directly. You have your audio pane to control mic and speakers, whether I'm blowing out your eardrums or I'm too quiet, adjust as necessary. And then the questions pane. If you have a question for the staff, and as most of you, as I can tell by the screen scrolling through here, I've already figured that out, are typing in your questions. Jay and Aaron will do their best to get you the answers to that, but remember, if you don't get it answered, we promise to get the answer to you in a follow-up email to everyone that registered here. So, although this is kind of a welcome screen, I'm going to give you a bunch of no signs here. We are not going to cover a few things. We are not going to cover hobby operations other than maybe referencing it here or there, but this is not a seminar designed to teach you how to fly as a hobbyist, nor will we be discussing things like FPV drone racing. I understand that's a big topic right now, and there's a lot of different opinions, and I'm not going to cross into that area because I don't have a solid definition to give you folks. So I'm not dodging the question, I'm just avoid giving you bad information. Anything that's ongoing lawsuit, we're not going to discuss. If you have frustration with the federal government, I understand you have every right to have frustration with the federal government, but we are not going to solve that problem here tonight. Also, business plans. I am not going to teach you folks how to start a UAS business, nor will this webinar prepare you to pass the UAG knowledge exam. So this is not a ground school. This is not something that you're going to watch and then go take the test and pass with 100%. So as long as we're clear on those topics not covered, I'm going to get to our first poll here. Just let me launch it real quick. And you folks should be able to see it on your screen, and when you do, go ahead and make your selections and give me an idea of where you folks are coming from in industry. Okay, I'm going to close out the poll here in about another 10 seconds. One thing I'd like to point out, I'm kind of noticing in the question stream as it's coming through, is that please limit that area to questions only. I don't want it to be like a Facebook comment thread or some sort of Twitter conversation on there. The reason being is because I want to make sure the information that gets out to everyone comes straight from the source, either myself or Aaron or Jay. So if you see questions rolling through, please don't try to answer them in any fashion. Just simply ask the question and we'll get that to you. So I'm going to close out this poll here, and it would appear that over half of you are involved with aerial, photo, and video. closely followed by 22% are in data collection, the survey mapping, and then it's spread out evenly amongst, it would appear, the other or bridge and tower inspection and television film production. So good stuff. Thank you for taking that time to do that poll. We'll have a few more others as we go through. So briefly, we want to go through a little bit of the history of why we got here. I'm not going to go into significant detail, but what I want to bring up is that UAS operations aren't new. They've been around a long, long time. Quite frankly, you can go all the way back to the 50s and 60s when you look at RC-controlled aircraft. Where it really became popular was in the 70s. You had folks building these from scratch or designing them from kits in their basement, and they would generally form clubs, go out and operate in sparsely populated areas in a club environment. And this worked well for a really long time. In fact, in 1981, if you take a look at that on the screen, that's Advisory Circular 9157. Currently, we're on Advisory Circular 9157A, which is kind of the rewrite of this. But all the way back in 1981, the FAA issued this saying, hey, we recognize you guys are flying these aircraft in the National Airspace System, and they're model airplanes, and you're staying away. So we came up with some guidelines and operating standards, not a rule, but certainly some standards that we expected folks to maintain in the RC community. And that worked well. It worked well all the way up until rather recently. I believe this was in 2012. And it changed because the knowledge and skill to operate remote-controlled aircraft changed. If you think back in the day, you had to understand lift, thrust, weight, drag. You spent the time building it. Now you can have somebody walk into a Radio Shack, buy a drone off the shelf, and walk out in the parking lot, hook it up to their iPad, and they're piloting a drone. They have no idea what lift, thrust, weight, drag means. That's not necessarily why Raphael Pirker got into a situation, but this is kind of what kicked it off. Mr. Pirker operated his UAS around the University of Virginia campus and medical center, taking videos, swooping underneath and over and around heliports. That's what caught the FAA's attention. And what ended up happening is the FAA charged him with violating quite a few rules under Part 91, based on the fact that we were stating unmanned aircraft systems, or UA, are aircraft. And, of course, he fought that and said, no, that's not. It's a toy. It's my hobby. So we lost in the lower court. The lower court judge says, the FAA, this is a toy. It's not an airplane. You have no standing. Well, the FAA appealed that. It gets up to our highest appellate court, which is the NTSB. And the NTSB affirmed the FAA's position, which is, yes, unmanned aircraft systems are aircraft. So that's really the key decision we have right now and how the FAA got involved in all this anyway. Again, not going to debate this. I know that there's probably lawsuits and differing opinions on it, but the facts as it stand right now for law, unmanned aircraft system are aircraft. And you can reference that NTSB decisional order there with FAA versus Pirker. Shortly after that, Congress enacted a law, the FAA Reauthorization Act, or Public Law 11295. This captured a lot of UAS or hobby operations in it. And one of the requirements of this Public Law 11295 was that the FAA establish a means for people to operate UAS commercially in the National Airspace System. The law goes into effect, trump congressional public law. It works the other way around. So we had to come up with a rule. We had to come up with something right away. And that's where you got the exemption process, Exemption 333. That was our bridge from Public Law 11295 coming all the way over to Part 107 operations. Now, many of you attending right now may have 333 exemptions. That was part of that process. Now, as of August 29th, we have FAR Part 107. So this provides for civil, which in our discussion here meaning commercial, UAS operations in the NAS. It also certificates remote pilots. So that's where we're at here today. So I'm going to bring up another poll, second one here, and you should be able to pop that up on your screen, and it's discussing the experience you may have operating UAS. So I'm going to let you Closing out the poll here in about 10 seconds. Here I've got just about 90% of you have participated. I'm going to close that out. Over half of you are 0 to 2 years, followed by 31% in the 2 to 5 years, 6% 5 to 10 years, and only 7% have gone 15 years plus. That's fantastic news. The 0 to 5 year group is the group I want to reach. So I've really got my target audience here. That's excellent. I appreciate that. So one thing about registration, yes, you have to register. Why do you have to register? Well, now under Part 107.3, it requires it, and it references 91.203. And you can see on the screen there what 91.203 states is that if anybody's operating a civil aircraft, it must have an effective U.S. registration certificate issued to the owner. So there's where the requirement comes to register your aircraft. How do you do that? With our registration page. registermyuas.faa.gov, I believe, is the address. If you just probably Google FAA UAS registration, it'll be your first link on there as well. Going into this page, you have two options to select, hobby or commercial, and I'm going to explain the difference real quick. As a hobbyist, you will register yourself, and it's kind of a bad way to put it because nobody wants to be registered personally to the federal government, and I get it. But what we're really doing is we're registering all of your hobby UAS. You're going to get one number that's applicable to every one of your devices. You can label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on all 10 of your UASs that you fly for hobby. Under commercial, you are going to register each UAS individually. You will receive a unique identifier, registration number, and certificate for every one of your UAS, and they have to be marked accordingly. So if you have a commercial certificate, you may operate that UAS as a hobbyist. There's no problem with that. If you have a hobbyist certificate, you may not operate that as a commercial because each individual UAS under commercial rule has to be individually registered. So that's how the two different registrations work out. Registration is $5 and it recurs every 3 years on your UAS. So what do you do when you get that number? You have to mark your UAS. No, you don't need 12-inch end numbers on the side, but somehow that UAS has to be labeled. Permanent marker, engraving, any means that is going to permanently identify that registration number on the UAS. The key with the registration number, it has to be readily accessible, maintained in condition that is readable and legible upon inspection. You can put it in an enclosed compartment, but only if it takes no specialized tools to get at it. If it takes some sort of unique 1 in a million screwdriver hex head to open that compartment door, you can't put it in that compartment door. We're talking tools that are available to just about anyone with a home repair kit. They have to be able to get at that. So another poll here. I'm going to keep you guys active so nobody falls asleep under here, but one more poll, and it talks about what you're currently authorized to do. About 10 more seconds here. I'm going to close out the poll. We're getting near the 90% mark again. That seems to be where kind of most polls on webinars die off. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out here now. And it looks like you're split right down the middle between yes, you are currently authorized to operate, and no, you haven't taken the UAS knowledge exam yet. So it's right down there, half and half. So excellent representative group of folks that have done the work and are ready to go, and folks that are gearing up to do the work so they can be ready to go. Again, thanks for participating in that poll. So, myth versus facts. I kind of debated long about whether or not I should include this, but I think it's important because there's far too many myths out there right now, and I'd like to dispel some of them, not all of them. However, the first one here is probably the most prominent myth I hear is I'm not getting paid, therefore I'm not a commercial operator. The fact is, Anytime you're operating a UAS in furtherance of business, whether you're being compensated with cash or you're just doing it simply because it's part of your business model, that's considered a commercial operation. So realtors, nonprofits, media production, advertising, demonstrations of product, anything that you're doing in furtherance of your business is considered a commercial operation. The one example I like to give really kind of lays it out nicely. When you're talking about commercial operations versus hobby operations or furtherance of business, it's on a flight-by-flight basis. So the example I give in a lot of my seminars is this. You're a farmer, you own a lot of acreage. You bought yourself a UAS because you think they're neat, they're cool, you want to fly it around. You mount a camera on the bottom, you take a lot of pictures of your property, your farm, your crops, you post those videos to YouTube, you put some of them up on Twitter, you hang some of the pictures on the wall. You most likely are considered a hobbyist. I don't see anything there that you're doing that wouldn't be considered a hobbyist operation. Same farmer, same UAS, same field, goes up and takes photographs of the crop and decides, I need to apply a particular pesticide here, or I have a dry area in my field over here, and then you modify your farming business based on that, you're now commercial. Nobody's paying you to do that as that farmer, but you're doing it in furtherance of your business. So that's one of the key points you have to remember. It's not you receiving a paycheck, it's the purpose and intent of your UAS mission that will put you into the hobbyist or the commercial bucket. Here's another one. Drones, RC airplanes, etc. are not aircraft. We kind of already discussed this. The fact, yes, they are. Section 40102A6 of the U.S. Code of Regulations defines any contrivance invented, used, or designed to navigate or fly in the air as an airplane. We define it in our CFR 1.1 as a device that's used to be intended to be used for flight in the air. I always get somebody in the audience at some point during my live presentation I know says, so paper airplanes are aircraft and they have to be registered. That's ridiculous. No, paper airplanes are not aircraft. They cannot navigate in the air. That's a key part of that. When we get into kites and balloons, we have rules specifically for those, but we're talking about devices that are used to navigate or fly in the air. They have to be capable of flying in the air. Paper airplane doesn't meet that requirement. This came up just recently. It's kind of a hot topic, and it's a really interesting one because it's not unique to remote pilots. It kind of comes across all avenues of pilot certificates, but the myth is remote pilots aren't really pilots. You guys, you're not really flying airplanes. You didn't take a flight check ride or something, a lot of different real. Here's the fact. I'm telling you, yes, you are. You are a certificated airman under Part 107. You have just as much remote pilot and command responsibility as pilot and command responsibility. You are a pilot. You hold a remote pilot certificate. You are operating an aircraft in the National Airspace System. The grade of pilot certificate doesn't make you real or somebody more of a pilot than you. Pilots always like to say, well, you're not a real pilot until you fly this airplane, or you're not a real pilot until you get a tailwheel endorsement, or I hold an airline transport pilot. I could say, and private pilots aren't real pilots because they haven't done all the testing I have. All of it's ridiculous. You completed a course of training, whatever training, self-study, or paid somebody to do it, you pass an exam, you received your remote pilot certificate in the mail, you are a pilot. End of discussion. Next one, hobby recreational operators are exempt from FAA regulations. I told you we talk a little bit about hobby. This may be about it here. This is not true. You are not exempt from FAA regulations simply because you self-identify as a hobbyist. You are controlled by Section 336 of Public Law 11295. All right, you're still flying something considered an aircraft by the FAA, and you are subject to certain regulations. 9113, careless and reckless operation. 101.41, 101.43 are specifically designed for model aircraft operations in the NAS. So if somebody says, well, I'm a hobbyist, I don't have to follow the rules, that's not correct. There are certainly rules they have to follow. Not going to get into them here, but I would recommend those people check them out. Here's another good one. This one will take a little bit more explanation. The FAA doesn't control airspace below 400 feet, or 83 feet, or 70, or 100, or 500, whatever the number happens to be. I've heard numbers all over the place. Fact is, yes, we are responsible for the safety of all airspace from the ground up. This includes any airspace that is defined as navigable, and that extends to the surface. Aircraft have to take off and land. Unmanned aircraft have to take off and land. Therefore, they are navigating in airspace as soon as they come off the ground. Where this came from, and what everybody likes to cite, is a 1946 U.S. Supreme Court decision under the U.S. versus Cosby rule. So let me try to explain this a little bit. Again, we're not going to get into a heated debate on this. I'm sure there are opinions all over the place, but here's the deal. Mr. Cosby was a chicken farmer, all right? He claimed to own airspace directly above his property. His property was located next to a military field, and as a result, you have jets coming in, taking off, landing over his property as low as 83 feet. He claimed that that was killing his chickens or preventing his chickens from laying eggs, affecting his business, so he sued the government for taking over his land. That last bullet point is key in this conversation, is that it was a lawsuit brought on the illegal taking of land. So let's go into this a little bit more. The court ruled that landowners have the right to full enjoyment of their land. Okay, that reference immediate reaches of the atmosphere. All right, they agreed that this was a government taking because it prohibited the full enjoyment of his land. Again, it's all based on land. And when I say it referenced immediate reaches of the atmosphere, it did that because you cannot say that a jet flying 35,000 feet over your house is ruining the full enjoyment of your land. So it had to deal with the immediate airspace around it. The actual case had to deal with land. It's a land case. So since then, there's been 70 years of law in aviation development. Congress has gone on to define navigable airspace to include airspace needed for takeoff and landing. Obviously, UAS operations expand this considerably. In order to claim taking of land, which again was the Cosby case, aircraft, you have to prove aircraft are flying over your land, low and frequent, and it directly and substantially interferes with your enjoyment of the land. It doesn't give you the right to the airspace. You don't own the airspace. It doesn't prohibit the FAA from regulating that airspace, but it does give landowners the right that if something's operating low and frequent, prohibiting their enjoyment or substantially interfering with it, they may have a case under Cosby. But what happens is people take that as 83 feet I own the airspace, and that's not true. It only applies to the taking of land. All right, the FAA has the authority from Congress to regulate navigable airspace. Moving on. Here's another myth. The FAA prohibits transporting property under Part 107. All right, the photo in this was a big thing. I think it made CNN. It was a beer company that was going to use drones to deliver beer to ice houses out on the lake in Minnesota. Yes, we're a little crazy here. We fish on the ice in the middle of the wintertime. Nonetheless, that was their plan. Whether it was practical or not, it didn't matter. But here's the fact. Yes, transportation of property is permitted under Part 107. The problem is it's not very practical at the moment. Why? When transporting property under Part 107, the transportation must occur wholly within the bounds of a state. That means you cannot transport property from one state line or across a state line from one state to another. It has to be within the state. The UAS must remain within visual line of sight at all times, and that cannot be waived. When we get into the waiver portion of this evening, you're going to see a lot of rules that can be waived. You cannot waive that if you're going to be transporting property. You cannot operate from a moving vehicle, and you cannot be transporting hazardous materials. So, yes, you can transport property under Part 107. However, probably not that practical for everybody's business plans that they really want to do, Amazon included. Another poll for you guys. Make sure everybody's awake here. This is just a poll I wanted to do to see how many folks out there are actually a certificated pilot under Part 61. All right, about 10 seconds, we'll close out that poll, get near that magical 90% number again here. I'm going to close that out. So I'm loving the results of these polls so far, and I'll tell you why. 70% of people responded no, that they are not a certificated Part 61 pilot. That's fantastic news because you guys will truly benefit from this seminar. Most people beyond that were private pilots, and some had commercial or ATP certificates, but almost 3/4 of you are going to find out a lot of information about how to read rules, how to deal with the FAA regulations, how to understand them. This is going to be a good seminar for you folks, again. So moving right into remote pilot certificates, how do you earn your remote pilot certificate? Some of you have already done this, some of you are on your way. The one thing you're going to want to do to make sure the process is expedited as much as possible is create an account through IACRA. That's our Integrated Airman Certification and Rating Application System. It actually does work pretty well. I've got a lot of good feedback from folks saying that they were pleased with how fast the process worked. You always have the option to do it on paper. You can print out the paper. It will just take a little longer. So create an account through IACRA. It's free to do. It expedites the process. Obviously the preferred way to do it. If you are a first-time pilot, so this applies to, again, almost 3/4 of the people here in attendance. If you're not a current Part 61 pilot, you are also considered a first-time pilot, meaning if you do not meet 6156 flight review requirements, but you hold a private pilot certificate, you have to follow this process as a first-time pilot. So the first thing you need to do, other than study, and I can't emphasize that enough, you need to study. We have some study guides published. There's a lot of courses out there. I'm not here to promote one or the other. Do your research and study. After that, schedule the appointment with the Knowledge Testing Center and pass your initial aeronautical knowledge test. That test is going to include areas on regulations relating to privileges, limitations, and operation, airspace, weather, loading and performance of the small unmanned aircraft, emergency procedures, crew resource management, which may be a foreign term to you at this point. Also, radio communication procedures may be in there, determining performance of your small unmanned aircraft, the physiological effects of drug and alcohol, you need to understand those, as well as ADM, or aeronautical decision making and judgment. You obviously need to know airport operations, and then maintenance and pre-flight inspection procedures. So there's a lot of information that you're going to need to know to pass that exam. Once you've passed the exam, and right now we're hovering around 87 to 88% success rate for people taking their exam the first time. That's a fantastic number. It means people are doing their homework. Once you pass that test, you're going to complete your FAA Form 8710-13. We speak in numbers here all the time. What that really means is you're going to go back into IACRA and you're going to complete a remote pilot certificate application. Once the TSA vets your background, you will receive an email, automated email from IACRA that will allow you to log back in and print out your temporary certificate. Later on, the remote pilot permanent certificate will be sent to you in the mail, but that's taking a while. Some people are starting to get theirs now, but it's probably going to be coming in waves. The key to remember for first-time pilots or non-current Part 61 pilots is that there's no additional signatures necessary. You don't have to go find a CFI, you don't have to visit the physio, you don't have to go find a designated pilot examiner. Complete the application and submit it. Oklahoma City and Airman Records takes care of your vetting and processing of the application. So another poll here, and then this may be one of the last polls we see for a while here, but I'm curious to find out how many folks are registered through FAASafety.gov. All right, we're climbing back up to my magic number again here. I'm going to close out the poll here because it's not that difficult of a choice to make there, but 3/4 of you are registered with FAASafety.gov. That's fantastic news. There are 2 wings credits that are applying to this seminar. If you haven't registered through FAASafety.gov, obviously you've registered through Citrix because you're here, but if you have not registered through FAASafety.gov, please go there, find this seminar or find this webinar. It's going to be, you can search the entire U.S. It'll be on there, same title and everything. And make sure you register so you can get the appropriate wings credit. I'm not going to do a huge presentation on FAA wings because for the unmanned aircraft system pilot, the remote pilot I should say, we're not fully up to speed yet to make that 100% useful for you guys. But thank you for those of you who are. If not, take a poke around FAASafety.gov. There's a lot of good information on there for manned pilots. There's some decent stuff on there for unmanned aircraft pilots. It'll get better as time goes on. So again, moving on. So now if you're a current Part 61 certificated airman, the application process is a little bit different. If you're not a student pilot and you're current with your flight review, you're going to complete your online course through FAASafety.gov, which has like a 30-question kind of exam at the end that corrects to 100%. The difference being once you complete that, you're going to need to visit a DPE or an aviation safety inspector like myself, or a CFI or an ACR to process your application. Out of all of those, the only one that cannot give you your temporary certificate right away is the CFI. They don't have the authority to do that, but you could get your temporary certificate immediately with visiting a FSDO, ASI, or a DPE, something of that nature. Again, if you do a CFI and you're a certificated airman, you're going to get an automated reply. It seems to hover around 7 days for those of you who are not Part 61 pilots from the time you submit to the time that you receive your email for your temporary, and about 4 hours for those that are Part 61 pilots going through IACRA, who are not obviously visiting a DPE or an ASI. The big difference in time is because for Part 61 pilots, you've already been vetted by the TSA. So that's kind of complete. They don't have to do that additional background check on you. That's what your remote pilot certificate's going to look like. I can say for a fact that is what they look like. I don't have mine yet, but I have my temporary and I'm waiting like a lot of people, but I've seen some posted online and that's certainly what they look like. Again, I want to drive home the point that is an airman certificate, and you hold a remote pilot certificate with a small unmanned aircraft system rating. You are a pilot. Currency, just because you get your certificate doesn't mean you're done. Periodically, you have to update the required aeronautical knowledge to continue to operate in the National Airspace System. This is done through either a recurrent training course or recurrent knowledge test, and it has to be done every 24 calendar months. What is that test going to be like? I don't know. We haven't issued it yet because nobody needs it yet. We just published the rule. Nobody has their certificates until at least August, or I should say nobody has to complete it until at least August of 2018. But here's kind of a good table. I'm not going to read through the table. I do my best not to read PowerPoint to you folks. But you can take a look at that and see precisely how the recurrent training cycle works. If you pass it on this day, when you need to train by, what if you don't? What happens is the clock is reset. So screenshot that or whatever. Hopefully I can get this published after I record it and you guys will see that again. But I believe I took this out of Advisory Circular 107-2, so not too hard to find. The return training course is going to include applicable regs, emergency procedures, CRM, maintenance and pre-flight inspection procedures. Again, we don't have the course developed yet, so I can't specifically tell you what it's like. Is it going to be the same as the UAG knowledge exam? Not quite sure. We'll have to wait probably a good year before we see some of that. All right. So here we go. I hope you guys have your popcorn ready and your favorite beverage in hand because we're about to get into the meat of this presentation. I do have a planned break ahead. Probably another 25 minutes before we hit that mark. So bear with me as we get into the rules here with 14 CFR Part 107. We are going to go through, excuse me, every rule. Okay, we are going to go through every rule. For those rules which aren't that clear or I felt need to be explained a little bit in more detail, I'm going to do that. But some of the rules are pretty straightforward. So we're not going to spend a half hour talking about one particular rule when it's easy to understand. The first thing, Part 107.1, applicability. So who does this rule apply to? Every one of our rules starts out with kind of a .1 applicability. And this particular rule applies to registration, airman certification, and operation of small unmanned aircraft systems within the U.S. We're talking civil, commercial, UAS operations. It doesn't apply to air carrier. any aircraft subject to Part 101, which includes hobbyists and model, or operations under Section 333. I want to explain that one last bullet point on there. If you hold a 333 exemption, it's still valid as long as it hasn't expired with the expiration date that's published on there. But assuming you hold a valid 333 exemption, you can still use that exemption, but you have to choose which bucket you're going to fly out of. You're either going to fly out of the exemption, 333, or Part 107, but you cannot do both. So if you choose to operate under your 333 exemption, maybe you have some specific COAs that go with it, and it gives you more opportunity. You can still operate under that. You have to follow all the conditions and limitations on your 333 exemption and any pertinent COAs that go with it, and you may operate commercially using that exemption. If you choose to operate under Part 107, you have to push aside any special COAs or privileges you might have had in that exemption and follow all the rules under Part 107. So both are still valid, but you have to pick one or the other, and you can't combine them. So Part 1.3 here, 107.3, goes into definitions. We define what a control station is, what corrective lenses are, what a small unmanned aircraft is. So for this rule, a small unmanned aircraft is anything weighing less than 55 pounds on takeoff, including everything you may attach to it, everything that's on board, cameras, whatever it happens to be. That means if the aircraft, small unmanned aircraft, weighs 60 pounds, you may not operate that commercially under Part 107. 107 only applies to small unmanned aircraft, and they define that as, I should say, we define that as something that weighs less than 55 pounds on takeoff. We talk about unmanned aircraft systems, small unmanned aircraft system. When we're talking about SUAS or UAS, we're talking about everything involved. That's the aircraft, it's the data link, it's the control station, it's the flight controls, it's the computer software required to run it. That is the small unmanned aircraft system. It's kind of a holistic approach to it. Otherwise, we're talking about unmanned aircraft. And that's specifically the device that's flying in the National Airspace System. Visual observer is defined. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but a visual observer is designated by the remote pilot in command to help them keep the UA in visual line of sight at all times. We'll get into this a little bit later on. It's not meant to be a daisy chain extension. So it's not meant to be, I've got a visual observer, he's a mile away, so I'm going to fly it over his head and then go a mile beyond him. I can't see it, but he can. That's not how the visual observer system works. So hang with me, we'll get there. 107.5 talks about falsification, reproduction, or alteration, essentially saying you cannot do anything that falsifies any record required by the FAA. That's your remote pilot certificate. That could be operations manual that you might have as part of a waiver you've received. Certainly would apply to your waiver or ATC authorizations. You can't alter or falsify any of that. Registration would be followed. If you do, you're looking at some pretty serious consequences. They can be denial of application. We can deny your certificate of waiver, suspension or revocation, or even civil penalty. We can, at the FAA, we can fine people for violations of the regulation. From personal experience in dealing with some cases where I did investigations that involved falsification, it's generally revocation. It's one of the few things it seems like the FAA, we don't take lightly. This is highly an honor-based system. We don't have enough inspectors to watch what you do every single day in the field. We are not going to be there for every single takeoff and landing. We expect you to operate as professional pilots in the National Airspace System, and as such, falsification goes against every ethical standard we'd have as a professional. And therefore, I've seen the FAA go very diligently after pilot certificates for falsification. So it's certainly something that's real, and it's certainly something that's very uncommon. I should emphasize that. So 107.7, as a remote pilot in command, RPIC, I'm going to start using a lot of abbreviations to fit this stuff on the screen. You must make available to the administrator your remote pilot certificate with a small US rating, any other document or record, such as a certificate of waiver, or any test or inspection of the SUS that the person manipulating the flight controls to determine compliance of that part. So what it's saying is that if an FAA inspector, who is a representative of the administrator, comes up and decides to do a ramp check, it's going to be one of those things that you are required to provide that documentation. You can't say, I'm not going to give it to you. So this codifies that if you do get visited by an FAA inspector, hopefully it's a positive experience, and they're going to ask to see certain things, and this is where they're getting that authority from. All right, accident reporting. This is a little bit different than manned aircraft. So we have a specific rule under 107.9 that identifies you must report accidents, certain accidents, to the FAA. We don't have this rule necessarily under Part 91 General Aviation Operations. There is a requirement to report to the NTSB, but 107 is a little bit unique in the fact that we have a rule that requires you to report directly to the FAA. So we define an accident as any serious injury to a person or loss of consciousness or damage to any property other than the actual unmanned aircraft that is greater than $500 to repair or replace, whichever is lower. So let me kind of explain that. If the UA hits something that has a value of $300 and it costs $600 to replace it, the value is lower. That wouldn't constitute reporting. It has to be over $500 in value or over $500 with the repair and the replace. So how do you do it? How do you report it? Well, you can take a look at the screen there. We have some numbers. These are our regional operations center that run 24 hours a day, taking phone calls for precisely these types of events. Depending on where your state is, or I should say, depending on where the accident occurred, it's going to give you a few different phone numbers to call. If you don't want to call, excuse me, you can do it online. FAA.gov/UAS, I believe is our main website, has an accident reporting link on that website. You click on it, that window will pop up, and you can submit your accident report that way. Very easy to do. I guess what I would probably do is just submit it online here. It seems much simpler than trying to call somebody and explain it to them. But we do offer that accident reporting portal online. Another quiz here. This one is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be a quiz, and I want to see what you guys come up with an answer. So it wouldn't be an FAA presentation if we didn't have a quiz. So here we go. Best of luck to everyone. All right, getting ready to close it out here, about 10 seconds, getting a pretty good response back from you guys. So I'm going to close it out. The answer to whether or not you can fly under a 333 exemption, COA, and Part 107 simultaneously is no, you may not. Think back to what I explained between that 333 and Part 107. You have to pick one or the other. And if you have a COA that's attached to the 333 exemption, and you want to use that COA, you must use your 333 exemption in its entirety and not 107. If you're going to operate under 107, you don't get any of the provisions in your 333 exemption. One or the other. You got to pick. All right, some operating rules. This is the meat. This is what everybody likes to talk about here. So applicability. These rules under Part 107 for operations of small unmanned aircraft apply to any aircraft systems unmanned subject to this part. Now, which ones are subject to this part? We covered that in 107.1, which is anything that's under 55 pounds, so on and so forth. We do require you to have a remote pilot certificate with a small unmanned aircraft system rating. The rule reads, except as provided, no person may manipulate the flight controls of the small UAS unless they have a remote pilot certificate with a small US rating, or, this is a big or, that person is under the direct supervision of the remote pilot in command, and the remote pilot in command has the ability to take direct control of the flight of the SUAS. Now, I apologize for reading that word for word for you guys, but some of these, I unfortunately have to do that. The key point is that whoever is operating the SUA under Part 107 has to either hold a remote pilot certificate issued under this part, or have that person who holds a remote pilot certificate standing right next to them with the ability to take command of that small UI if something goes wrong. So that's the difference. You can have somebody operate your small unmanned aircraft under Part 107 without a remote pilot certificate, as long as somebody who has a remote pilot certificate is near them. Now, we get into a remote pilot and command. So you have your remote pilot certificate, and the FAA has this other thing called a remote pilot and command. Folks that are current, or I should say that hold Part 61 pilot certificates are very familiar with the term pilot and command, so I'm going to bring it to you guys as well. Remote pilot and command. The rule states, except as provided, no person may act as remote pilot and command unless they have a remote pilot certificate with a small U.S. rating. We require a remote pilot and command on every flight. There is an exception in there. It has to deal with civil, foreign, registered, small unmanned aircraft. I'm not going to really get into that. For the purposes of our discussion, every single UAS flight under Part 107 must have a designated remote pilot and command who holds a remote pilot certificate. As you saw in the previous slide, that person doesn't necessarily need to be flying the UAS, but if they are not, they need to be right next to the person that is, particularly if that person does not have a remote pilot certificate. We do not require medical certification for you to operate your UAS under Part 107. You don't need a third-class medical. You don't have to visit an airman medical examiner. However, if you have any reason, whether you know or have reason to know that you have a physical or mental condition which would interfere with the safe operation of the SUAS, you may not operate under Part 107. This is a big self-certification piece. So if you go out and you've got some sort of medical issue, or you should know that you have a medical issue and you choose to operate and something goes wrong, the burden is on you for that medical self-certification to say, I know I couldn't see straight yesterday, but I decided to fly anyway and I hit a tree. Okay, well, if you can't see straight, how did you have a reason to believe that you wouldn't interfere with the safe operation? The bottom line is it's self-certifying. You go out, are you physiologically capable of flying that UAS safely? That's what we need to know. So again, a remote pilot and command, 107.19, must be designated before or during the flight of the small unmanned aircraft. They are directly responsible for and have the final authority as to the safe operation of that small UAS in the NAS. They have to ensure that it doesn't pose any undue hazard to other people, aircraft, property, in case that UA loses control for any reason. So they must ensure that the UAS complies with all of Part 107. If you're the remote pilot in command, you are the captain of that aircraft. You're wearing the 4 stripes. You go to the airplane terminal, airline terminal, you see the pilots walk around, 4 stripes on the shoulder, they're the captain. They're going to be the pilot in command. You guys are going to be the remote pilot in command of your aircraft. All right? You must have the ability to direct the small unmanned aircraft to ensure compliance. All right? You're in charge. It all falls on your shoulder. So here's one of my first explanation screens for you guys. So the remote pilot in command should have their certificate easily accessible during flight operations. Again, one of the things that the FAA inspector could ask you if they happen to visit you during one of your operations or one of your missions is they are going to ask to see your remote pilot certificate if you're going to be the remote pilot in command. So you should have that with you. It shouldn't be somewhere in your car or at home. It's something you're going to want to carry with you. All manned aircraft pilots carry it with them at all times. I recommend the same for you guys. Point number 2. As the remote pilot in command, again, you're the captain, and as such, you may go down with the ship. That seems a little bit harsh, but the buck stops with you. If you've identified that you are the remote pilot in command for this particular UAS mission that's happening, whether you're flying it or you're standing next to somebody that's operating it with the ability to take control if you need to, and something goes wrong, we are going to talk to the remote pilot in command. We will talk to the captain. We will want to know why the captain allowed something to happen. It's the way shipping works out. It's the way aircraft, airlines, aviation has worked out as well. What 107.19 does allow is transfer of control of a small UAS between certificated remote pilots, meaning you can pass off that remote pilot in command responsibility. In transferring control, what we require is that both of you are capable of maintaining visual line of sight without any loss of control. It can't be done where one of you loses sight of it momentarily. The transfer of control of remote pilot command, responsibility, and authority must happen while both of you can see the UA. So you have one pilot designated as the RPIC at the beginning of the flight, and at some point during the operation, you can transfer that responsibility and control as long as it's done in a positive manner so that nobody is doing this when something goes south. That happens. So if you're going to be transferring remote pilot command authority, it must be clear and unambiguous, meaning you've got the aircraft, you're remote pilot command. Roger, I've got the aircraft, no, I am remote pilot command. However it works out. What you don't want to have happen is, I think I passed it off to that guy, and now it just went through the school window, and the FAA and the police just showed up, and he was the remote pilot command, and he's like, well, no, you were the remote pilot command, I never took. That has to be positively communicated between the two of you. If you have an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, you may deviate from any part of this rule to the extent necessary to meet that emergency. It doesn't give you a blank check to violate every rule in the book, but it certainly gives you the green light to deviate from any rule on this part needed to ensure the safety of the NAS. If something's going wrong with your UAS, you've got an in-flight emergency, whatever it happens to be, do whatever it takes to keep the national airspace system safe and do whatever it takes to keep people around you safe. You are the captain. You save the ship, you save the people. That's your job. Deviate from the rules as necessary. If you do that, you may be asked to submit a report. It's not mandatory. This is not an accident mandatory report. This is, I had to declare an emergency. I was about to lose battery power on my small unmanned aircraft. It was in a hazardous area, so I had to operate over people to get it out of there in time. Okay, if the FAA comes up and they become aware of that, we may ask you just to submit a brief statement on that. We're not looking to violate you. We're looking to gather data, gather information on that. You may not have to submit a report. The only thing that really concerns me, coming from a safety standpoint as an FAA safety inspector, and I've been doing this now not that long, for about 9 years, is when we have an event that happens, it's an in-flight emergency, whether it's unmanned or manned aircraft, and nobody declares an emergency. There's no reason not to. We're not going to come kicking in your door and taking all your toys. We're not coming there with golden scissors to cut up your pilot certificate. I would rather have you declare an emergency, use 107.21 as your authority to deviate from the rule, rather than try to keep complying with the rule and have something really bad happen. That's where I start to get a lot more questions asked of people. It's like, well, why don't you just kind of go with the emergency rule and do this? I'd rather see you use the emergency rule in a true emergency than not. In terms of hazardous operation, you may not operate in a careless or reckless manner. Pretty straightforward, not that difficult to understand. You don't want to be endangering people or property or anything like that. You cannot drop anything from a small unmanned aircraft that creates an undue hazard to persons or property. So, can you drop something from a small unmanned aircraft? It would appear so, as long as it's done in a manner that doesn't create an undue hazard to persons or property. We have the same rule for manned aircraft, so it's almost word for word when we took it and parsed it into Part 107. You can operate your small UA from a moving vehicle. All right, it cannot be from an aircraft. I don't know why anybody would try to do that, but it can't be from an aircraft. And you can only operate it from a moving land or waterborne vehicle over a sparsely populated area, and it cannot be transporting property. Again, this goes back to yeah, you can transport property under Part 107, but we have some rules that don't really make it easy to do. This is kind of one of them. So if you're going to be operating from a moving land vehicle, car, truck, or a waterborne vehicle, boat, jet ski, it has to be done over a sparsely populated area, and it can't be done for compensation or for hire. What's a sparsely populated area? We don't define it. Much to the chagrin probably of many FAA and safety inspectors over the year, we have no formal definition of sparsely populated area. We leave that up to the operator to determine that caveat. I wish I had a better answer for you guys, but if you're going to say I'm going to operate from a moving vehicle, I've determined this area to be sparsely populated, that's on your shoulders. If the FAA inspector comes out and says, this is like the middle of downtown Atlanta, where are you getting that from? that will be up to you and the courts and something to decide later on. But we do not define sparsely populated area. So you can Google it and try to find some answers. Some lawyers have written about it in different cases, but officially there's no definition for that. So again, you can operate from a land or waterborne vehicle over a sparsely populated area. It doesn't remove any visual line of sight requirements. You still have to maintain VLOS with your small UA. And you got to make sure that it doesn't unfairly risk any people or property or anything of that nature. Alcohol or drugs. Right now we have a rule in 107.27 that redirects you to another rule in Part 91. This is fairly common when you get into reading FAA regulations. Any part certificated 61 pilot will tell you that you read one rule that references this, unless this rule over here says this, which ties you to that rule over there. It's how the rules are written. So welcome to the FAA, welcome to our rules. 107.27 will redirect you to 91.17 and 91.19, which state within 8 hours after consumption of alcohol, you may not operate the UAS. You got to have what the pilots like to say, 8 hours bottle to throttle. You got to have that time in between. If you're under the influence of alcohol or any drugs, or if you have a blood alcohol content of 0.04 or greater, you may not operate under Part 107. Daylight. You may not operate at night. You may operate in periods of civil twilight, as long as your small unmanned aircraft have anti-collision lighting on it that can be seen for at least 3 miles. Civil twilight, as you see on the screen there, talks about 30 minutes before official sunrise and ends at official sunrise, and then beginning at official sunset, and then carrying on for 30 minutes after that. Folks that might be tuning in from Alaska, it's totally different up there. Sometimes the sun just never sets for you guys, so please check specific rules when we get into the Alaska stuff. But you may operate during the day and civil twilight, as long as you have those anti-collision lights that can be seen for 3 miles. What does that mean? We have no certification standards for small unmanned aircraft, let alone lighting systems. So a lot of people say, well, you got to comply with Part 23 or it's some sort of aircraft certification requirement. We don't have that. This is a performance-based standard, a performance-based rule, meaning that you just have to demonstrate your lighting on the UAS can be seen for 3 miles, or should be able to be seen for 3 miles. That's the requirement. There is no minimum luminosity. There's no specifications for lights. We don't do any of that. It's a performance-based rule. So, can you see that from 3 miles away? If so, then you're good to go. Visual line of sight. Here's another big one here, folks. 107.31. You have to maintain visual line of sight of your UAS. That is unaided by anything other than corrective lenses. So that goes for remote pilot and command. It goes for the visual observer and anybody manipulating the flight controls. They have to be able to see the unmanned aircraft throughout the entire flight to know the location, altitude, attitude, direction. They have to be able to observe the airspace for any hazards, other aircraft, perhaps birds. And you have to ensure that the aircraft doesn't endanger life or property of another. That has to be done by the remote pilot and command and the visual observer. You can't pass that off. It has to be within visual line of sight at all times. So throughout the entire flight, the ability to describe what I just talked about must be exercised by either the remote pilot and command of the SUS or a visual observer. And I'm going to explain this here real quick. I'm going to jump back to my screen here. The intent of this visual observer is not to relieve the remote pilot and command of VLOS responsibility. It is designed to allow the remote pilot and command to temporarily lose visual line of sight with his UAS by looking down, adjusting something, working on a system component or software component of what they're trying to do. The visual observer can maintain visual line of sight with that aircraft while the remote pilot's heads down. It doesn't mean that that device can be flown somewhere where the RPIC can't see it, but the visual observer can. So if a visual observer is used during that operation, all the following requirements must be met. So again, the remote pilot and command and the visual observer must maintain effective communication with each other at all times. That means I have to be able to talk to you, you have to be able to talk to me. That can be done electronically, walkie-talkie, cell phones. We don't get into too much detail on that, but we do specify effective communication. So whatever communication medium you're going to use between the remote pilot and command and your visual observer, it has to work. It has to be effective. All right. So the remote pilot and command must ensure that the visual observer is able to see the UA in the manner specified previously. Again, it has to maintain visual line of sight. We don't have a rule that permits beyond visual line of sight operations. So coordination between the two is outlined in 107.33. This is coordination between the visual observer and the remote pilot and command. The coordination is designed to scan the airspace where you're operating your small unmanned aircraft to identify any potential collision hazards and maintain awareness of the position through direct visual observation. Again, that ties to me as a remote pilot looking down, temporarily adjusting something for some reason. I've got my VO who's watching my UAS, whether it's on hover mode or whether it's tracking a GPS track. I have that ability to maintain visual line of sight with it because I can always look up and see it, but they are physically eyes on the bird at any given time. Now, unless properly certificated and equipped, visual observers cannot assume remote pilot and command responsibilities. You can't pass off your RPIC duties to your visual observer unless they happen to be a remote pilot and have that certificate and they accept that responsibility. So they assist you again. If you go eyes down, the visual observer is there to assist you. You still, as a remote pilot and command, must be able to see your unmanned aircraft within visual line of sight at all times. This doesn't relieve anybody of any of that. And effective communication must take place. Don't necessarily care how you do it, but you have to have effective communication between the visual observer, because if the visual observer is far enough away where maybe they can't shout at you very effectively because of highway noise or something like that, and you go heads down and they see something happening that's dangerous, they have to be able to communicate with you instantly, whatever means you do that. So that could be voice, handheld radio, any real method that creates an effective communication and does not create a distraction. Texting probably isn't the best idea to maintain effective communications between a VO and the RPIC. In terms of operating multiple small unmanned aircraft, you may not. A person may not operate or act as a remote pilot in command or visual observer of more than one unmanned aircraft at the same time. Now, this is going to be one of those rules that's waivable. We'll get to that here in a little bit. You cannot carry hazardous material. And for the purposes of Part 107, we define hazmat as, I'm just going to let you guys read that. It goes to the Secretary of Transportation. It talks about health and transporting and commerce, things like that. We pull the definition out of 49 CFR 171.8. So that's how we define hazardous material. All right, pretty exciting stuff there. I'll give you guys a second to read that and jumping forward. If you're going to operate near aircraft, here are the right-of-way rules under Part 107. You must, as a small unmanned aircraft remote pilot in command, yield the way to all aircraft, airborne vehicles, launch, and re-entry vehicles. You have the responsibility to get out of the way. In terms of operating near them, you may not pass over, under, or ahead of it unless you are well clear. What does well clear mean? Look at it from a safety standpoint. You want to be so far away that it's not going to create an undue hazard. Be well clear. You may not operate so close to another aircraft to cause a collision hazard. Pretty self-explanatory on that one. Operating over people. Oh, this is a good one everybody likes to talk about, and especially since our administrator mentioned it was one of the first rules that we're going to be looking at here short term to potentially modify. We'll have to see. But 107.39 prohibits operating over a human being. Apparently aliens are okay, unless that human being is directly participating in the operation of that small unmanned aircraft, or they're located under a covered structure or inside a stationary vehicle that provide reasonable protection in case that UA came down on their head. The first bullet point under there is where everybody starts to kind of diverge in terms of who is directly participating in the operation of that small unmanned aircraft. So here's what we define. This, I believe, comes straight out of Advisory Circular 107-2, which is one of the handouts you can download. People directly involved with the operation of the small unmanned aircraft system are the remote pilot in command, or another person manipulating controls as provided by rule here, the visual observer, or any crew members necessary for the safety of the small unmanned aircraft system operation as assigned and briefed by the remote PIC. So one of the questions we get a lot, what about actors? What about the movie talent or whatever it happens to be? Are they participating in the operation? Because we're filming their scene with the UAS. The way this reads is no. The actors or talent involved are not directly participating in the operation of the small unmanned aircraft system. You got to look at those 4 bullet points. The people you can fly over legally under Part 107.39 are one of those 4 groups. Either the pilot in command, manipulating the controls, the VO, or crew members necessary for the safety of the operation. Actors, talent aren't necessary for the safety of the operation. Filming a marathon, you can't tack up a sign that says, hey, we're going to be shooting this marathon with the UAS. You guys are all participating now. Doesn't work like that. They have to be directly related to the safety of the UAS operation. On to the next exciting subject, operating in certain airspace. The rule states, unless prior authorization from ATC is given, nobody may operate an unmanned aircraft system in Class Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or, and here's the mouthful of words, the lateral boundaries of the surface area of Class E airspace designated for an airport. What that last bullet point is really saying is Class E to the surface. So I'm going to kind of reference that as E to the surface from now on, but we're talking about the lateral boundaries of the surface area of, okay, you guys have seen that enough. Operating in the vicinity of airports, you may not operate in a manner that interferes with operations at traffic patterns at any airport, heliport, or seaplane base. Notice this is different from a lot of what Exemption 333 allowed and what are required of hobby operators. Your typical Class G airport does not require ATC authorization to operate around. However, you must maintain compliance with 107.43. So let me explain that a little bit. Although it doesn't require notification to the airport operator, it's best practice to do so. One of the first things I mentioned to you guys at the beginning of this webinar was that it's on your shoulders now. It's really up to you guys to determine how the future of UAS is going to work with the FAA, or with public perception. It's on your shoulders. So everything you can do to make people understand what you're doing and how you're complying with the rule and how you're doing this safely is going to benefit the entire industry. I really can't emphasize that enough. The rule says you don't have to tell the airport operator you're going to be flying a UAS near your bad idea to let them know. Open up that dialogue with them. Start that communication. You might be surprised how well you're received. So again, it applies to airports, teleports located within Class G airspace. If you're going to operate near an airport, the RPIC must be aware of all the traffic patterns and approach corridors to runways and landing areas. You have to understand the airport operation area. You can't go in there blind and not understanding the runway layout or what active runway is being used that particular day or where the aircraft are inbound from. You have to avoid operating anywhere where the presence of your SUAS may interfere with operations. This includes approach corridors, obviously, but taxiways, runways, helipads. And obviously, you still have to give right of way to all of the aircraft, including aircraft operating on the surface. So just because something's taxiing by doesn't mean you've got the right of way. You always have to give way. One of the explanations that they give in Advisory Circular 107-2 is this. If you're hovering your unmanned aircraft 200 feet above a runway, and let's say there's no other airplanes around and you've done your due diligence, and now you've got an airplane that taxis up and is holding short of the runway, and they cannot take off because you're hovering over there. In effect, you have interfered with the operations at the traffic pattern at an airport. It would be in violation of 107.43. So before you go carte blanche operating into airports in Class G or heliports or seaplane bases, have a very good understanding of how that airport operates. How do you do that? Contact the airport operator. Open up that dialogue. Open up that discussion. Be safe. Operating in prohibited or restricted areas, not that different than manned aircraft. You may not operate a small manned aircraft in prohibited or restricted areas unless you have permission from the using or controlling agency as appropriate. For folks that aren't really in tune with how that works, what is the using agent or controlling agency? So what I have on the screen now is a restricted area. This is straight off a sectional chart. Now, keep in mind, this is not a lesson to teach you how to pass the UAS knowledge exam, but I want to emphasize this part here, 107.45. Restricted area 4103, that shows up on the map. I'm going to try something which to me is like next level cool because I'm a little bit old. But say you wanted to operate in this area here that I've circled on the map horribly. Say you wanted to operate in that area. Could you? How do you know? What does it go to the surface? Who do I contact? Is it part of this Miller Army Air Force base? You know, what is that? So here's what we do. You have to look at the side panel of the sectional. If you've never owned a sectional, they're getting harder to find these days, but go out and try to find one. What you'll find is this is what the side panel looks like. This is for the particular Twin Cities sectional chart. If you go down, you find the special use airspace and you see, oh, restricted area R4301. That's the one I want to operate in. Oh, it goes up to 27,000 feet. So it absolutely includes the surface. When is it used? Looks like 7:30 a.m. to midnight and other times by NOTAM. They will notify me 24 hours in advance. The controlling agency, Minneapolis Center. So I'm going to jump back to this picture. Who would you contact to receive ATC authorization, or how would you go about getting that? Minneapolis Center is the one that's going to grant you authorization to get into that airspace. Now, they will probably most likely coordinate with Fort Ripley, Camp Ripley in that area, but that's who the controlling agency is, Minneapolis Center, and that's how you find out. That's the same for prohibited area, restricted area. A lot of military operations areas are the same way. This rule 107.47 is the TFR rule. Essentially, we identify, like you're now starting to get used to, we redirect you to part 91.137 through 145 and 99.7, what really amounts to TFRs. So you may not operate a UAS in TFRs, whether it's in the vicinity of a disaster hazard area, national disaster areas in the state of Hawaii, emergency air traffic rules, flying too close to the President of the United States or other dignitaries, flying too close to where they're doing space launches off of Cape Canaveral, or we have a rule for abnormally high barometric pressure conditions. There's also kind of the permanent TFR that exists, which is the stadium TFR, people like to call it, that exists over certain stadiums of a seating capacity and type of venue. Regardless of which TFR it happens to be, no UAS operations are permitted inside a TFR. I got a couple more on here, I guess, but essentially they're saying the same thing. TFRs, no fly. If you got a TFR active in the area, you're not going to go flying that particular day. And I'll show you how to find out here later on. You are required to do a pre-flight on the UA. You can't just unpack it out of its shipping crate or unpack it out of its protective case and launch it. You have to, as the remote pilot in command, assess the operating environment, consider all the risks to people or property in the immediate vicinity, on the surface, and in the air. These are things that you have to do prior to flight, not just one flight, all flights. You have to complete this. Your assessment must include local weather conditions, airspace, and any flight restrictions, i.e. TFRs, the locations of people or property on the surface, any other ground hazards which may play a role in your operation. And you must ensure that everybody directly participating in the UA operation informed about the operating conditions, emergency procedures, so on and so forth. This gets back to people who are participating in the direct operation of your small unmanned aircraft. Back when we were talking about operating over people. This is the briefing that you have to give them. You have to ensure that anybody participating in that safe operation knows the operating conditions, emergency procedures, contingency procedures, roles and responsibilities, potential hazards. That's your responsibility as a remote pilot in command. There's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. You have to ensure that all control links between the station and the unmanned aircraft are working properly, and you must ensure that it has enough power to fly for your intended mission. This is similar to manned aircraft pilots, making sure there's enough gas in the tank to get where they're going. And make sure that anything you've got mounted on the bottom, GoPro cam, or whatever type of video device or sensing device, doesn't fall off, essentially what that boils down to. We provide a lot of publications on this. We have topics on aviation weather, aircraft loading performance, emergency procedures, ADM, airspace. These are all free. You don't need to pay for any of these. If you go to our FAA website and you find the handbook section, or Use Google and just type FAA handbooks. All of them are in PDF format. All of them are free. You can download that, put it in your tablet or computer, whatever device you want to use. All right, but in addition to all that, make sure that the device is capable of flight. Do the propellers operate as they should? Do the control system operate as it should? Do you have adequate power? So on and so forth. Make sure that whatever you have at the bottom doesn't fall off, and then make sure that you have documentation with you. If you're operating under a waiver, you're going to want that waiver with you. You're going to want your remote pilot certificate with you. You're going to want the aircraft registration with you. These are all things you have to have ready to go prior to flight. You are the captain. You need to have these documents with you. Operating limitations. So here's kind of the nuts and bolts of the actual flying of the device. We limit it to a ground speed of no more than 100 miles an hour, and you have to have at least 3 miles of visibility observed from the location of the control station. So wherever you're at, you have to determine my flight visibility is at least 3 miles. You cannot fly higher than 400 feet AGL unless you're within 400-foot radius of the structure. Then you may fly up to the top plus 400 feet above that structure's uppermost limit. If the radio antenna is 1,000 feet tall, you may operate within 400-foot radius of that up to 1,400 feet AGL. That's what this rule permits you to do. You do have to maintain cloud clearances. You have to be at least 500 feet below and 2,000 feet to the side of any cloud. You cannot fly above the cloud. So why do we have these? Well, among other things, we want you to have an ability to have time to make adjustments, to identify hazards and react to that, to make sure that you're maintaining safety and taking appropriate actions. A lot of different ways to determine ground speed. Quite frankly, if you own and operate a UAS, you know the best way for you to determine ground speed, but that's the controlling factor, ground speed. Same thing with altitude. Most of these references are in AGL, above ground level, but you really want to understand the difference between MSL and AGL altitudes. If you don't, time to hit the books. But again, determining altitude, probably best left to you guys as you know the UAS system the best and how it relates that information to you. Cloud clearances. How do we do that? Your eyeballs are probably the worst uncalibrated tool to determine cloud clearances. So the best way to do that is to obtain local weather reports in an aviation format. Where are the clouds at? What are the bases of the clouds at? Because if I know the bases are at 1,000 feet, I know that I have to be 500 feet below that, so I'm going to be limited. Even if I'm within 400-foot radius of a structure, I'll be limited to 500 feet AGL max because of the clouds where they're sitting at. Don't forget your local laws and regs, all right? Just the state of Minnesota, I can tell you, they're going to require that you register your UAS with them, that you're going to have a commercial operating license with them, and that you're going to have to prove minimum insurance requirements to them. The FAA does not require insurance. We don't require a commercial operator license, so to speak. We issue registrations for $5, and we issue remote pilot certificates. That's our requirement. But every state's going to have their own set of rules, and if they don't have them now, they probably will very soon. Check with your state. Just because you met all of the FAA requirements doesn't mean you've met your state requirements. I can't emphasize enough. We don't regulate privacy at the FAA. That's not what we do. It's not what we have regulations for. But many city and states do, and they have very specific privacy laws. And you're kidding yourself if you don't think they're talking about how to control privacy with drones right now, because they are. I've been involved with legislatures here in the state of Minnesota. It is a topic that is being discussed right now. So know your local laws. Extremely, extremely important. All right, one more quiz here as we close out this section. And this should be an easy one for you guys if you've been paying attention at all during the first portion of the presentation. All right, wrapping this one up here, I'm going to close it out, maybe just a skosh early here. The answer is the remote pilot and command. They are the one with the responsibility and final authority to the operation of the UAS. Remember, the remote pilot certificate gives you the authority to operate it. The remote pilot and command is responsible for all of that. So over 90% of you got that answer correct. So that's excellent. I've reached my maximum butt in seat time, and I'm assuming many of you have as well. We're going to take a 10-minute break, refresh the popcorn, refresh your beverages, stand up, move around a little bit. I will update the screen kind of as a 5-minute countdown, but for right now, we're all going to take about a 10-minute break. All right, we are back. Here we go. And just a quick shot of numbers. It looks like nobody deserted us during the break. Hey, that's a good thing. Either you guys don't have a lot going on, or this is actually some pretty good stuff. Either way, I'll take that. So we have a tremendous amount of questions rolling in. Thank you guys for all those questions. I know a lot of it has to do with ATC authorizations and clearances. I talked with Jay, who's kind of running some of the questions a little bit offline. He may have given some outdated information, so listen, follow, stay with me here. We're going to go through this, and I'll get you guys up to speed. So other than the rule, this is what everybody wants to talk about, waivers and authorizations. All right, so before we get going into waivers and authorizations, I want to talk about some definitions. There are so many of these definitions right now being used interchangeably out there. I've seen it online in social media forums, or I've just been talking with remote pilots or people talking about UAS. I thought it'd be a good idea to clear this up a little bit. So the first thing I want to talk about is exemption. An exemption. Listen, an exemption is a request made by an operator to not comply with the rule as written, but use an alternate method of compliance which ensures safety in the NASH. They are generally approved by headquarters. Think 333 exemption, all right? Those are issued to the exempt commercial U.S. operations from regulations, and they had a conditions and limitations section of that exemption which required outlined the alternate method of compliance. That is an exemption, all right? Exemptions are a little bit more difficult to get. They have to be approved by headquarters. You got to have some really legitimate reasons. They're generally given for rules that are not subject to waiver. So if a rule is subject to waiver, you're not going to apply for an exemption on that rule. You would apply, for example, one of the rules that we can't waive is operating a UAS from an aircraft. You could apply for an exemption of that rule because we don't waive it. So that's exemption. Waiver, this is what you guys are all interested in. A waiver is applying for relief of a rule that the FAA has identified, which we have. We have a list of rules under Part 107 which are waivable. All right, so you're applying to get relief from that or more of the regulations that we allow. Normally, waivers are processed by the FSDO. Each individual FSDO issues, reviews, and authorizes the waivers. They're not doing that with UAS right now, and for good reason. They want that to be kind of handled by headquarters so we get some consistency out of the gate. As much as we try to do things standardized, insert all your jokes about FAA standardization here, we can kind of deviate a little bit around when it comes to each different FSDO. So what we're trying to do out of the gate is ensure that the waivers, when they come out, they're standardized. Everybody's getting kind of the same treatment, if you will. Eventually, they're going to be issued by the FSDOs. I don't have a timeline when that's going to happen. A lot of waivers involve coordination with ATC. Just because Flight Standards issues the waiver doesn't mean we don't talk to air traffic control. You have certificates of authorization. Those are issued by air traffic control, and they're issued to an individual or an entity for operating as, generally speaking, public use, or a lot of people who had 333 exemptions received a certificate of authorization, COA or COA, depending on how you like to pronounce that abbreviation. This particular authorization does not come from Flight Standards. A COA is issued by air traffic. Yes, air traffic is part of the FAA, and you're getting an FAA COA, but it's not a Flight Standards COA. Flight Standards issues the waiver and the exemption. Air traffic issues the COA. For all practical purposes, and certainly for our discussion here, if you're operating under Part 107, you're not going to get a COA. You're not going to need to apply for a COA. So let's talk about what you will apply for, and that is an ATC authorization. You remember that rule that said you cannot operate in certain airspace without ATC authorization? This is what we're looking at. You are looking at receiving ATC authorization. It's required prior to entering Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or there's my own little term again, E to the surface airspace. It's officially submitted by your request through the online portal. We're going to kind of go over that here. UAS operators should not contact air traffic control directly to obtain ATC authorization. I have heard reports of that working out. People have tried it. There's nothing to prevent you from doing it, but I will tell you, as of last week, I've heard from everyone that all the air traffic facilities are saying, go to the portal, go to the portal, go to the portal. It seems like air traffic and flight standards are now on the same page with this. So please do not contact the air traffic facility directly. If you want ATC authorization, it's done through our portal. Enough about that definition. So requesting a waiver or authorization. Here's some general guidelines. Submit your application as soon as possible. You should submit that application at least 90 days prior to the start of the proposed operation. Now, I can literally hear you guys through my webcam right now screaming rage because that is completely impractical for UAS type missions. I gotcha. Hang tight here. It doesn't mean it's going to take 90 days to approve it. In fact, it probably won't. But we have to outline kind of a worst case scenario. If it's a run-of-the-mill standard waiver request or routine ATC authorization request, I'm going to be 4 miles to the north of your Class Delta airport. I'm never going to be higher than 10 feet. I sincerely doubt it will take 90 days to do that approval. But we have to give you the worst case scenario, because if somebody has a very complicated waiver request and they have a very tight or high or potentially hazardous UAS ATC authorization request, we need time. We need time to work through that. Either the waiver or the authorization, remember they are not the same thing, have to be submitted through the online portal. Some tips. When you're requesting a waiver, only select the Part 107 regulations that need to be waived. Don't select every single one thinking, well, I'll just get them all and then problem solved. No, you will considerably extend the entire footprint of receiving your waiver if you have 2, 3, 4, 5, all regulations requested. Okay, so only select the regs that you are going to need to perform your operation. You're going to want to fully describe the mitigations to meet the performance standard. Performance standard, I'm going to get into that. We have performance-based standards, and I'm going to tell you how to do every single one for every single rule that's waivable. So if the FAA is processing your waiver and they request additional information, don't delay. Write us back right away and say, here's what you need to know. It's back in your court. All right, because after 30 days, if we don't hear anything, we kick your request out, and that's a horrible thing to have happen. So be responsive when when we ask you for more information. So requesting a waiver authorization. Here's the screenshot of the page. It's our kind of our main FAA UAS web page. If you look on the right hand side, I'm going to go super fancy again here and go with my pen and try to outline this. All right, that's where you would click on, and it will bring up this page right here. So I'm going to erase my drawing here real quick. When you're submitting that waiver or authorization request online, and it's one portal for two things. So we didn't do a whole lot of favors on deconfusing it for you, but we have one portal for the two different types of things, waiver and authorization. Regardless, the responsible person has to be identified. That is going to be the official holder of the waiver. The responsible person ensures the operation is conducted safely, observing the provisions of the waiver or authorization, has ongoing knowledge of the operation of the small unmanned aircraft system when it's happening, and they're not required to hold remote pilot certification. This is the responsible person for the waiver, not for flying the unmanned aircraft under the waiver. The responsible person can be the representative of an organization. If so, you want to put that name of the organization into the box that's identified. We have to have a responsible person identified because we have to have a point of contact at your company that we can get a hold of if something changes or a waiver needs to be amended or altered in any sort of way. That responsible person is going to maintain a list of pilots as well as the types of UAS operating under the terms of that waiver or authorization. They'll also maintain any records or other information required to demonstrate compliance with the waiver or authorization. So if the waiver or authorization requires you to maintain a certain document, the responsible person is the one in charge of maintaining that document. Mailing address, pretty straightforward. The thing you want to remember, it cannot be a post office box. It has to be some location where we can send certified mail. Certified mail, yes, that's where the postman delivers it. You have to sign for it before they walk away. So it has to be somewhere where certified mail can be received. We do require a phone and email, particularly when we're talking about airspace authorizations. Easy for me to say. But we have to have a phone number and email the responsible person for that waiver or authorization. When you get to the remote pilot section, you're going to put in the remote pilot in command who's going to operate under that waiver. Not necessarily all the different remote pilots, but the remote pilot in command. The head cheese, the captain, their name goes there. For an airspace authorization, the responsible person is required to maintain the current list of pilots and the remote pilot certificate number used in their operation. This list that's maintained has to be presented to the FAA upon inspection. Remember that one of those first rules we went through about all the things that you'd have to produce if a FAA inspector visited you? This would be one of them. Mailing address, same requirements you have for the responsible person, you have for the remote pilot in command identified here. Phone and email, same thing. Pay particular attention to ATC authorization requests because whatever phone number you put in there for an ATC authorization request has to be one that you will answer during the flight. So if you say I'm available at 555-555-5555, ATC is going to pick up the phone because they need to get a hold of you. You got emergency aircraft inbound. That better be the phone number that you answer because you're operating or somebody next to you is operating at UAS. When it comes to the airman certificate number, do not enter your Part 61 pilot certificate number if you have that. This is your Part 107 remote pilot certificate number. And if you don't have it yet, if you're like me and you've got one of these temporary certificates, enter pending. That's okay. You can enter pending in that airman certificate number. For the small UAS, you're going to enter the manufacturer, the model, and the registration number. Remember, under commercial operations, each UAS has to have their own individualized registration number. You can add more than one UAS. We conveniently added a little button there for you. You can click. So now, to specifically request a waiver, those were general guidelines for requesting either one. Either one of these, whether you're going to request a waiver or an authorization, you're going to need to fill out that top part. Now we're going to get into the specifics of requesting a waiver. You have one box, all right, when you request your waiver, waiver/airspace authorization. All right, there are two sections. You've got ATC authorization and waiver. Again, ATC authorization is this port here. If you're looking to receive authorization to operate in certain airspace, that's the one you want to check. If you're looking at getting a waiver for a particular regulation, this is the one you're going to want to check. Know the two sections. Select the regulation you want. That is the list in totality of all the rules that we allow subject to waiver. You're going to need to put in times. This is for a waiver now. Think waiver. All right, so the date and time the operations are scheduled to begin and end. If you're going to conduct multiple flights over a period of time, enter the date that it's going to be on the start and enter the date that would potentially be the last day you operate. Waivers may be approved up to 4 years. Again, this is not an authorization, this is a waiver, and a waiver may be approved for a period up to 4 years. Think of a waiver for daylight operations. You want to operate at night. We can approve that waiver for your night operation to last 4 years. So the idea of, I'm going to operate at night, I can't believe I have to submit a waiver every single time I want to fly at night 90 days in advance. Everybody relax. Submit it. It may take a few days. It might take a couple weeks to get that initial waiver, but we have the ability to issue that waiver for a valid period of 4 years. So the idea is we want to try to make it effective as possible for you guys to conduct your business. You'll want to select the appropriate time zone as well. Proposed area operations, you want to have a detailed description of the geographic area, boundaries using street address or easy identifiable landmarks, distance and direction from the nearest public airport. If site specific, provide the center point operation in the latitude longitude box. We haven't really started approving waivers yet that I've seen, unless some came out earlier this week. We've been a little bit busy, so I haven't tracked it specifically as I'd like to. So I don't know how this works if you want to, say, receive a certificate of waiver for the entire United States. I'm not sure how that works yet. So I apologize. I don't have that answer for you guys. Hopefully I will. I'm sure I've got some questions floating by on the side here that may be asking that. I just don't have that answer for you guys yet. So enter your latitude, longitude, if specifically needed for that particular area of operation. Enter your proposed maximum altitude in feet AGL that you're going to want to fly. Unless it's site specific, you don't need to put in lat long. Other than for a waiver of 107.41, like if you're requesting a waiver so you do not have to comply with ATC authorization, again, you're requesting a waiver of that rule, you would have to put in latitude, longitude information. But for other than that, it's not necessarily required. Finally, submit it. Look, you got to click on the I'm not a robot, you're not some sort of cyborg sent to destroy mankind. Click submit, and away it goes. You may not get something back right away. It says, congratulations, you've submitted a waiver on the FAA. We're all proud of you. The system is new. We're doing our best to make sure it functions well, but there are going to be some growing pains. There are going to be some hiccups, so bear with it. If you don't get a response back right away, hang tight. I know that they have given tracking numbers to people, and I know some people are clamoring for their tracking number. So there is a little bit of a lag in there. Again, this is all pretty new. August 29th is when this started happening. So what are these performance-based standards? What do I have to identify to the FAA to move forward with my waiver request? So we may issue certificates of waiver authorizing deviations from any rule in 107.205 if the UAS operation can be safely conducted and conducted under the terms of that certificate of waiver, COW. So your request must contain a complete description of your operation, the justification that establishes the need for the waiver, and that it can be conducted safely under that term. We're not just going to be handing out waivers because you think someday you might decide to operate maybe at night. If we're going to waive a rule, and this isn't something we're making difficult for UAS, it's the same for manned aircraft. If we're going to waive a rule, there has to be a specific reason why. The rule is in place to ensure safety. What you're asking is to not comply with that rule to ensure safety, so we want to know why. So you're going to need a legitimate reason why. Once you receive that waiver, you may deviate from the regulations of that part to the extent specified in your waiver. Simple as that. If there are conditions and limitations in your waiver, you must comply with those as well. All of them, not just one or two, you must comply with all of them. So here's how we do it. If you want to receive a waiver for operating from a moving vehicle aircraft, you have to demonstrate a method to ensure you evaluate the area for hazards, you analyze the risk to people and property, and you control or eliminate those risks. You have to ensure visual line of sight is maintained from a moving vehicle. You have to ensure that everybody involved is free from any distractions, and you have to ensure any lost data link procedures account for dynamic location of the RPIC. Dynamic location, yeah, you're not standing in one spot. You're in a car moving down a road, or you're maybe in an airplane if you're trying to request that waiver. You have to ensure that. By the way, these performance-based standards are all available in one of the handouts. So if I cheat and I look over here really quickly, I can pull up my handout list and I title it Performance-Based Standards. There you go. You can download that if you can't capture all this stuff on the screen, because I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly in the interest of time. The other one is daylight operation. You want a waiver for that? You have to be able to maintain visual line of sight during the darkness hour. You have to have a method to avoid other aircraft or people or ground-based structure. You have to know the position, altitude, attitude of their small unmanned aircraft. And you have to make sure that anybody participating is aware of any visual illusions that occur at night or any physiological conditions which may degrade night vision. Again, we specify this in that handout I have. So if you're going to request a waiver for daylight operation, these are the 4 bullet points you're going to need to identify to the FAA and how you're going to do your operation. Excuse me, 5 bullet points. There's one more screen. You have to be able to increase the conspicuity of the UA to be seen at a distance of 3 miles unless something is in place that avoids all non-participating aircraft. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but I wanted to give you an idea of what our performance-based standards are. You want to operate beyond visual line of sight. Here's your performance-based standards. You're going to see a lot of these standards repeat themselves throughout all these different waivers, but essentially this is another way for you to look at something and have one step ahead when you make that waiver application. You're going to say, I know I need to do this because it's a performance-based standard, so I'm going to put that in. Every little bit helps. Every little bit that you do here on the front end speeds up the process on the back end. One of the other reasons that again, you have to have sure all the required persons participating have relevant knowledge of the UA and that it's not operating in thin visual line of sight. We waive 107.33, but it doesn't seem like there's any good reason yet to waive that. So we have no performance-based standards to waive the visual observer. Because visual observers are not required, there's no necessarily any good reason to waive it unless you're combining it. So as a standalone, doesn't make sense, but as maybe combination with another waiver, it would make sense for you to not have a visual observer. Again, I'm not sure why we have that, but that is there. You can apply to waive the rule saying you can only fly one small unmanned aircraft at a time. And if you're going to do that, you have to have a means to resolve failure of signal and multiple aircraft or systems. So that's what you have to somehow identify to us here at the FAA. We can waive operating your aircraft, and for some reason we can waive right-of-way rules. If you're going to waive the right-of-way rules, you have to have a method for the manned aircraft pilot being involved with the joint operation to detect and avoid you. You can't apply for this and just say, okay, I've got this waiver. Every aircraft has to give way to me in my super UAS. It's a joint involvement with the manned aircraft. Operating over human beings. Here we go. I'm going to explain this one because it's probably the most questioned one we have. If you want to operate over humans, you can apply for a waiver. That waiver application must identify that you have a method so that ensures any malfunction doesn't cause injuries to non-participating persons on the ground. You have to have some way to keep people safe underneath you. You have to mitigate risk to non-participants through operational risk assessment, testing data, addressing design features with software, whatever it happens to be on your UAS that you believe is a good tool to prevent hurting people, you want to identify that. You need to address the risk from rotating parts. Those blades, when they come down, they will cut you, as some of you may already know, but they certainly have sharp edges, and we have to have a way to address that risk of exposure from those. You have to be able to show that the remote pilot in command or whoever's manipulating controls of the small UA has adequate knowledge, experience, and ability to safely operate that UA over people, all right, including recent flight experience from the last 30 days. So what that means to me is If you haven't flown a small unmanned aircraft system for 3 months and you apply for this waiver, you may not get it. Now, operating in certain airspace, this is the ATC waiver. It's going to be a tough one to get. That's the vibe I'm getting, and I'm probably pretty close to that. So you have to have a method to ensure that you're going to operate safely and efficiently without obtaining clearance from air traffic control. You have to have a way to be contacted by air traffic control because you are in their airspace. But really, for this one, you're going to have to explain why our authorization process won't meet your needs. You have to say it's too burdensome, or there's some reason, and I quite honestly can't think of any right now. Maybe you guys can, but you have to demonstrate some sort of reason to say that, hey, look, the authorization process doesn't work for me. I need a waiver from this rule. You can get waivers for certain operating limitations. You want to go faster than 100-mile-an-hour ground speed? There is a list of performance-based standards you can see on your screen right now that you are going to need to demonstrate to the FAA. If you do, and we agree, you can get a waiver to operate faster than 100 miles an hour ground speed. The same thing goes with altitude. You want to operate higher than 400 feet, not within a 400-foot radius of a structure, you can get a waiver for that. Again, looking at the screen, you're going to have to let the FAA know how you're going to meet all these methods and requirements. I can't emphasize enough, if you're going to request a waiver, be familiar with the performance-based standards. Download that handout I have, so when you submit your application, we don't have to ask you all this stuff. We don't have to, you didn't identify that you could be seen at least a 1 mile distance. So now we got to ask for more information. If you have everything up front, the process goes quicker. You can get a waiver for minimum visibility. You want to operate with a mile visibility instead of 3 miles as required by rule? You can get a waiver for that. Performance-based standards is going to identify what you need to let the FAA know and how you're going to comply with certain requirements of that performance-based standard. Cloud clearances. You can operate closer than 500 feet below, or maybe closer than 2,000 feet horizontally to a cloud. Again, performance-based standards. You have to have these situations, or these methods identified in your application to the FAA so they can say, they want to operate closer to a cloud, that's fine, they've met these requirements, we're going to issue the waiver. Now, the other half of that box, the ATC authorization, and this is where I want to clear up maybe a little bit of miscommunication here, that the questions have been coming through. You only have one box to check for an ATC authorization. And I'll state it again. The only authorized way for you to receive clearance to operate in Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or within the lateral boundaries, Class E to the surface, is through our online portal. If you call ATC directly, they should be telling you that. I'm certainly telling you that from Flight Standards. Now you guys know, and that is the only process. We are not approving airspace authorizations until October 3rd. That'll be the first date we start to issue airspace authorizations, and it will be for Class Delta and Echo to the surface airports. The next big date, I believe, is October 31st, and that is going to be for Class Charlie airports. The last big date will be December 5th, and that is going to be for Class Bravo airports. But nonetheless, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo to the surface, you must submit your ATC authorization request online. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about that here. You check the box that you're requesting an authorization. You're not requesting a waiver to operate in ATC Class Delta. You're requesting an authorization. You're going to need to specify the maximum altitude in AGL. You must complete the beginning portion in the same manner as requesting a waiver. So this is kind of where we get into the efficiency. It's a little bit confusing because it's one form, but it's more efficient because it's just one form that you have to fill out. But now we're talking about authorization, not waiver. You will need to put in the latitude and longitude, all right? The reason we do this, because I'm pretty sure at this point every Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo to the surface airport has grid mapped their airspace. And what I mean by that is air traffic has mapped out areas where, for lack of a better term, automatic authorization will happen. Now, don't get all excited because it's probably not going to happen right away. But in my earlier example, if you submit an ATC authorization request and your latitude, longitude, and your altitude puts you in an area that's 4.8 miles away from the airport center in Class D airspace, no higher than 20 feet AGL, the chance of an aircraft being 20 feet, manned aircraft being 20 feet AGL, 4.8 miles away from the airport is extremely remote, unless it's probably crashing. All right, so the idea is you're going to submit this online. It's going to be checked against that grid map. And these are all our goals. This is not something that's happening October 3rd. These are our goals. That if you fall into that area, you're going to get your authorization back instantly, but we're the federal government, so maybe not super instantly, as you may know the word, but it would be quick. I've had it explained to me on a few different occasions that the theory is you're standing at the spot you want to do your UAS operation that's within class echo to the surface, let's say. You submit your application right on your mobile device. You go to our web portal, you put in the data. It checks it against that grid, processes it through the system, sends an email to the controlling air traffic facility, and gives you an email authorizing you for the time, location, and altitude you specified. Maybe happening that fast. That's our goal. Again, don't anybody try to quote me and say that, hey, Kevin Morris said October 3rd, I'm going to punch it on my cell phone and get authorization right back. Won't happen on October 3rd. But that is definitely what we're working towards. So that's why we have to have the precise latitude and longitude. You're going to want to put in a radius. Okay, this is additional information for airspace authorizations, which is the radius from your latitude longitude point in nautical miles. Put in the nearest airport that you're going to be operating towards and what class of airspace that's going to be. Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo. Pretty straightforward there. You must answer additional questions here when you're asking for an agency authorization. There's a bunch of these yes/no questions. If you answer yes to any of them, you're going to put in a description of your proposed operation box to provide additional detail. Essentially, ATC wants to know if you're going to request their authorization. They're going to assume that it's going to be daylight. If you're going to operate at night, you need to let them know that you've got some sort of waiver for that so they can expect that type of operation. So they have additional information right there on the screen where you put in your authorization request into the web portal. Again, detailed description of your proposed operation. That's helping us determine whether or not, actually I should say it's helping air traffic to determine whether or not you're going to get an authorization for that location at that time of day. Just like a waiver, you're not going to be some sort of Terminator sent back from the future to destroy everyone. So verify you're not a robot, click submit, and away it goes. And just like a waiver, don't get too worried if you don't get a response back right away. In fact, don't expect a response back right away. Let the system come up to speed here in the next couple months and we'll get there. I know it's not perfect. I know you guys are itching to go right now in all these classes of airspace. You're frustrated with the FAA because it seems like we're moving slow. I get it. You're going to have to give it time. It's just going to take time to make sure that everything's done right and it's done safe. There are authorization dates. Again, for those of you who might be wondering what dates I just mentioned, and at least my memory was functioning correctly, and I got the right dates. So those are anticipated authorization dates. That doesn't mean that if you've requested it now, that's the date you're going to get it, but that's the date we anticipate beginning to issue. Air traffic begins to issue their air traffic airspace authorizations. Good quiz. You guys are probably getting tired of hearing me talk right now, so I'm going to do this real quick. This is kind of a quiz to see if you guys have been paying attention here. All right, going to be wrapping up the poll here pretty quick, or the quiz. I'm going to close that out now. The answer is false. 88% of you got that right. It's not the fact you're being paid or compensated. Certainly that is one component of being considered a commercial operator under Part 107. But remember, if you're operating in furtherance of business, realtors, I'm looking at you. If you're operating in furtherance of business, that's considered a commercial operation. Even though nobody necessarily is paying you directly for that UAS aerial shot, maybe they are, but even if they aren't, you're operating in furtherance of business. So certainly with that. Some web-based resources for you guys. The first one I want to put out there, and for those, some folks have kind of joined in lately, maybe some have dropped off, but I've seen some questions come up about not having their question answered yet. I don't know the number of questions we have right now, but it's a lot that are coming through our question portal. I'll say it again. Don't worry if your question hasn't been answered yet. We will answer every single one, and everybody that's registered for the webinar will receive that Q&A form back with all the questions answered. So I know some people may be like, I've been asking this question and nobody's getting to it. We're tight on time. There's 700 of you. There's literally 2 or 3 of us here doing this. We will get your questions, I promise. It just, you might have to wait a week for me to get all the answers together. But we're nearing the end, so stay with me. We're almost done, guys. I really do appreciate it, especially the East Coast folks who are getting close to 9:30 at night here. One of the resources you want to be familiar with is the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. That's a website. You just type in ECFR, and you want to go to Title 14 with the drop-down menu, and that's where you're going to find Part 107. The other thing some of you know about, or at least 3/4 of you did in that poll, is we have our FAASafety.gov website. This is in its infancy when it comes to UAS. It's a very robust safety information system for pilots of manned aircraft. We're going to get better with UAS, I promise you. So while you may log into it now, excuse me, this is wrong website. It's getting late for me too. This is our FAA website. So forget what I just said, but our FAA website here is the single best source of up-to-date UAS information. If you just Google FAA UAS, boom, you get to this website. Most of you are probably familiar with that already. Here's where I was going. Apologies, guys. This is our FAA safety website. It's free to register. When I put on seminars like this, I notify people through that registration portal on FAASafety.gov. You can register as a remote pilot, and if I tag something as I want to notify all the remote pilots, you will get that information. So if you haven't been there, go there now, but it's just FAASafety.gov. In fact, you can see it right under that Hot Topics screenshot. But go there or just Google FAA Safety. It'll be your webpage there. TFRs. You're going to want to be familiar with this website. And what I'll do is if I click on this, and I'm going to see if it's going to pull up for me. Hopefully all of you will be able to see this. And let's see if it comes up. I think it is. I think it's coming up for you guys if I check my screen. This is our website, tfr.faa.gov. You want to be familiar with this because the one thing, among others, but really a big thing you want to avoid is flying through a TFR. It doesn't go well for anybody. So what you can do is you can come up, you can select a state. For this example, I'm going to select, I'm kind of a homeboy here, hometown guy, select Minnesota. I'm going to click go. And once you guys see that, I'll kind of explain it. It's going to bring up all the active TFRs for the state of Minnesota. And when you click on and note them, it will describe in more detail exactly where that TFR is. It'll give you a graphical representation of the TFR. It'll give you the time that it's effective, the reason why it exists. It'll give you the altitude it's good for. So that is your single best source for finding TFR. So before you go fly, manned aircraft do the same thing. Before anybody flies manned aircraft, always check TFRs. I'm going to drop that off the screen and go on to my next one here. Now, this next one, I should preface this by saying I'm not advertising anybody's online chart system or tablet-based chart system or anything of that nature, but SkyVector is just one of many online resources where you can look at sectional charts. You just Google SkyVector, it'll come up. It'll even show you NOTAMs or what they like to call DROTAMs. You can see those on there. You can also see that sectional tab, what I was talking about with restricted airspace. You can click on viewing a sectional and scroll over to the side of the screen, and you will see the sectional side chart, or the side tab, side panel is what I'm trying to say. And you can find your restricted airspace in there. You can find the controlling agencies. SkyVector works. There are others. I'm not endorsing them. It's just one of many. Aviation weather. If you don't know this website, you should probably just Google Aviation Weather Center and get used to it, because that is your primary source for aviation weather. As a remote pilot in command, you are required to understand current weather conditions. This is where you can get them. It's a good source. You have to be able to understand what a METAR and a TAF is. And if I just said something where it made you scratch your head, time to hit the books. You got a test coming up. You need to study that. But you need to be able to decode that because it does apply to your UAS operation. Know Before You Fly is another good website. It's got, in addition to commercial stuff, it's got hobby stuff on there. It's kind of an industry-developed website. They got a lot of good information on there. Highly recommend going through that. It will give you a good idea of what you should know before you fly. All right, so we're nearing the end. I promised you guys some real-world scenarios here. So let's go with this one. Work with me on some of these. It's going to be a little bit difficult, but what I talked about, raising your hands, this is kind of where we're getting into it. So our first scenario. Here we go. You have been contacted by a company to take continuous video of the exterior of the newly constructed manufacturing complex. So I want you to make a couple of assumptions here on this one. And I'm going to get out my magic drawing pen. So what the company wants is you to take an exterior shot, continuous, all one video coming around here. Let's make an assumption that you have got a UAS that's capable of that flight, battery and camera-wise. And let's make an assumption that you have a UAS that's capable of doing a handoff via another control. So passing from one control to another. Got to make a couple of those assumptions here for this to work, because I do have a point to make, believe it or not. First thing, so assuming you've got the appropriate UAS and you can do that mission with the software and hardware you have, here's where that manufacturing complex was just built. By a show of hands, and you're going to need your little grab tab here to use your show of hands. By show of hands, how many people would say that they do not need to contact air traffic control prior to operation? So what I'm waiting on is you guys do all your hands raised, and I'm going to see a percentage on that, and then I'm going to give you guys the answer. I'd really like to make this more interactive, but with as many people as we have on the webinar, I'm a little bit limited, so apologies for that. All right, so people that have raised their hand, again, the question is, do you raise your hand if you do not need to contact? Did I say do not need to contact? Jake, can you help me out with that?
I'm sorry, Kevin. I was looking up something else here. Go ahead. Say again.
Jay wasn't paying attention either, so I'm not listening to me, and Jay's not listening to me. That's all right. So my point is, guys, it's getting late. I'm sorry. You've been troopers for hanging with me. You really have been. This is dry stuff. I get it.
I was up to my elbows in the rules right now.
Okay, so people are writing in and says, I said if you do not need to contact. Yeah, so raise your hand if you do not need to contact air traffic control. We had 24% raise their hand. Now the number's going up to 25. The answer is you would not need to contact air traffic control. So everybody hold off on raising their hands. I'm going to put everybody's hands back down because we get to do more of this here in a minute. The reason you do not need to contact air traffic control, and here again on my super cool pen, is because of the location. This magenta ring here represents Class E to the surface. I want to bring up another point that I mentioned earlier. I'm not training you to pass the UAG knowledge exam, but for the purpose of this scenario, this is what a remote pilot in command would need to consider. You are not within that magenta circle. That is Class E to the surface. So in this particular area, you are not within Class E to the surface, and you're not within Class D, C, or B. Therefore, no authorization from air traffic control would be needed. What you are underneath, and I'm going to get rid of my little drawing here, what you are underneath is the Class Echo to 700-foot transition area. That is going to be this red ring that kind of goes around here. So no air traffic control authorization is needed because you're not in Class Echo to the surface surrounding an airport, which is identified by a magenta dashed line around the airport. So being a good remote pilot, you are going to check the weather and you are going to check NOTAMs. So here's your NOTAMs. With that weather format, now I get a lot of you haven't got your remote pilot certificate, so you're looking at the screen going, I don't know what that says. But those of you that have passed it or understand how to read a METAR, looking at the weather report and the NOTAM list, and I'll say that for reference, Hibbing is nowhere near Redwood Falls where you're doing your shoot. By show of hands, based on these two types of information, who feels that they are authorized to operate based on this weather with this NOTAM? All right, the hands are rolling in, and I get it. I'm not going to use this percentage as a means to judge all of you guys because many of you haven't taken the knowledge test and haven't done much studying maybe yet, so that's okay. We're up to about 29, 30% here of hands raised. So what are we looking at? What does Part 107 require? Part 107 requires how much visibility? 3 miles visibility. If we look at this, we have 5 miles of visibility. So in terms of visibility, we should be all right to operate. We'll have to see when we get on site if we feel that the flight visibility is at least 3, but at least Redwood Falls is reporting 5 miles of visibility. And in terms of the NOTAMs, which is the TFR, I don't see any TFRs in my area that would affect me. So based on these two pieces of information as a remote pilot in command, I don't see weather prohibiting me, and I do not see any NOTAMs prohibiting me. So I'm going to say that I can do that operation. Now, how do I make a continuous video shoot of the exterior of this facility? And one of the ideas brought up earlier by Aaron, one of our panelists, is, well, I'll just stand on top of the building, maintain visual line of sight, and fly my UAS all the way around. I'm like, well, that kind of shot a hole through my whole plan, but certainly that could be a possibility. If you stood up there and you're able to get the shot you wanted, and you could see your UAS the entire time, that would absolutely work. What I was going for was that you can definitely make a shoot continuous around this by exchanging controls and remote pilot and command authority. And what I want to do is get out my little pen here. Again, assuming you have a UAS capable of exchanging control and can make the flight, if you had one remote pilot and command here, one over here, another one here, and one over here, technically speaking, Part 107 would allow you as remote pilot number 1 to launch that device. At some point in here, transfer control to remote pilot number 2, who also assumes responsibility as remote pilot in command for that UAS. He now has to maintain, or she, visual line of sight as it comes around the corner till it gets about here. And I think you guys are starting to see the idea. There's a handoff that takes place. They operate it here, and a handoff takes place, comes back over here around the corner. Some sort of handoff takes place, and it comes back to remote pilot certificate number 1. Part 107 allows this. You can put remote piloting commands in those positions. You cannot put visual observers in those positions. Visual observers don't have remote piloting command certificates. They're not controlling the vehicle. It has to be somebody who can assume the duties of remote pilot and command and has a remote pilot command or a remote pilot certificate. So that's kind of what I was going at. So can you do it? Absolutely. Is it practical? Maybe not. Maybe UAS can't exchange controls like that yet, but I would expect that at some point you could do that. I did see pop up, why not use a visual line of sight waiver? That's a possibility too. You could apply for a waiver and do this beyond visual line of sight. Absolutely great question. Now, I'm going to add a little bit to this. They want you to film a couple of towers that they put up there. There's the towers on the map right there. And you're going to have to do a little bit of math here. So generally speaking, what's the maximum altitude over a structure, we can fly a UAS if we are within 400 feet of that? Answer, 400 feet, right? If a structure is 1,000 feet tall, we could fly up to 1,400 feet AGL and still be within the compliance with Part 107 as long as you're within 400 feet of that structure, 400-foot radius. But I want to give you a real-world scenario here, okay? Remember, the weather was overcast skies at 1,200 feet AGL. Looking at the map, and because I don't expect you all to be able to read a sectional chart yet, if you're looking at the map, this tower is 400, or these towers are 450 feet AGL. That's that number in parentheses below the 1,455 feet, which is the MSL number. So 450 feet AGL. So based on that weather, could you operate over those towers? Answer, yes, you could. How high could you go, though? Remember, the cloud clearance requirement is that you have to be 500 feet below any cloud. So if the cloud layer is at 1,200 feet above ground, and we have to be 500 feet below it, simple math gets you a number of 700 feet AGL in order to maintain your cloud clearance requirements. So while the rule permits you to go up to 400 feet over this structure, which is 450 feet AGL tall, that means by rule I could go up to 850 feet. The clouds that particular day are going to restrict me to 700 feet. This is why it's extremely important for you to do your pre-flight work, to understand sectionals, to understand weather, to understand how to read these things, because as a remote pilot in command, you'll be required to know this. Now, adding on to this, and I'm going to ask you to do a show of hands here in a minute. I'm going to put everyone's hands down again. Sorry for those that may be raising for a question, but hang tight. If we're operating at 700 feet AGL, right at 700 feet, we are going to be 500 feet below the clouds at 1,200 feet, which is legal. We are going to be within 400-foot radius of those towers, which is legal. And we're going to be in Class E airspace. By a show of hands, how many people think we now need air traffic clearance because we are in Class E airspace? All right, numbers are climbing quite rapidly on this one. I don't want to bias anybody, though. So we're up to about 37, 38% of the people or so, and it's still climbing a little bit. The answer is you do not need air traffic control clearance. Now, everybody looking at the screen and my face and going, what? Here's the answer. Because that particular Class E airspace, which starts at 700 feet AGL in that area, is not associated with the lateral boundaries of an airport surface area. Remember the magenta dashed line around the airport in that picture. Air traffic clearance is not required. Air traffic clearance or authorization is only required in Class E if it is part of a surface area related to an airport. And we identify those areas on a sectional chart by dashed magenta lines. So just because it's Class E airspace doesn't mean you need to notify ATC or receive authorization. It depends on where laterally you are from that airport. So good discussion here. I'm going to put everybody's hands down again. We're getting near the end. I only got a couple more. Scenario number 2. A development company wants you to photograph aerial images of the latest housing project. Building a lot of construction out in their particular area. So here's the area they want you to film. Don't freak out. This wasn't a UAS. This is just Google Earth, Google Maps, whatever image. But that's the area they want you to film. Let's say that's the piece of paper they hand you. Say, here's the spot. We want aerial images of this. You're going to need to compare that to a sectional chart because that doesn't tell you anything about airspace. So you compare it to a sectional chart. And that's where you find out. You show that the box is right there in that area. So, same question, remote pilot in command. By a show of hands, how many people feel that air traffic clearance is required prior to operating over that site? All right, well, It looks like a lot of you were listening. Again, I'm not going to base everything, but we're at 40% and climbing. Absolutely. And I'll get on my little drawing tool again here. The reason air traffic clearance would be required is because there's that dashed magenta line. Okay? Now, what airspace are we in? We are going to be in Class E airspace to the surface. Let's say we're not operating above 8,500 feet MSL here. So we are going to be in Class E to the surface. That dashed magenta line is referencing Colorado Springs Airport. That is their extension of Class E to the surface. Because we're within that Class E to the surface area, authorization from air traffic control is going to be required. So before you even get close to doing this, you're going to want to request authorization from air traffic control. That is how you want to use your airspace sectionals and understand that. So what else do we check? We check weather. We're remote pilot and command. We're flying an aircraft. We're pilots. We check the weather at all times. And we also check TFRs. So according to the TFR check, there are 0 TFRs in Colorado. So I don't see any reason for a TFR I can't fly. What about the weather? By a show of hands, how many people feel that this weather would permit them to operate in that area? I'm going to reset the hands here. Sorry, guys. I think I kind of left that on from last time. So by show of hands, looking at that weather report, how many people feel that they could operate legally in that area? And I'm going to give a hint to some of those that may not have passed that test yet. That's visibility. All right, we're like at 6%. That's absolutely right, guys. Because that visibility is being reported at 2 miles, we may not operate under Part 107 unless, as one of our astute viewers pointed out earlier, you've got yourself a waiver to that rule. But we have 2 miles visibility, so we can't do it. We can't do it at least that particular time or that particular day. Here's another scenario. A wakeboard school has hired you to film their students from their boat with your UAS. Okay, they want you in the boat. They want you flying your UAS from the boat as they're pulling their wakeboard students. All right, seems like a reasonable request. Can we accept this job under Part 107? The answer is, yeah, probably. But what do we have to consider? One, we'd have to consider what airspace we're in. And for the purposes of this discussion, let's assume that this lake that we're on, it's not underneath a wildlife refuge. It's not part of any national park. It's not right underneath the airport runway. It's kind of out in the country. So airspace-wise is okay. The question I have for you, from a show of hands, how many people feel it's legal under Part 107 to film this particular mission from a moving vehicle? In this case, a boat. Show of hands, how many people say that's legal? All right, good. Shooting right up there to 40% again. Absolutely legal as long as you've identified that area as sparsely populated. Now, I look at this photo here and I'm looking at it. That doesn't look like it's densely populated to me. It looks pretty sparsely populated. So yeah, absolutely. So you consider weather, you consider NOTAMs, you consider airspace, and yeah, Part 107 allows you to operate your UAS from a moving waterborne vehicle as long as we're not what? Carrying personal property for hire, or I should say transporting personal property, or we're not doing it from an aircraft and we're over a sparsely populated area. So those are the things that we have to consider. These are real scenarios that you guys are going to run into. As remote pilot in command, you need to have capability to make that decision. I'm not going to be there watching you. I want to say we have roughly 3,500 safety inspectors for the entire United States. We can't be everywhere at once, and we do our job based on risk. So when we get back into this, again, it's on your shoulders. Nobody from the FAA is going to be making sure everything's okay before your flight. You as the remote pilot will. You have to check the weather. You have to check the airspace. You have to determine sparsely populated. You have to determine whether or not you can operate in compliance. It's really all on you. That's good because you don't constantly have the FAA breathing down your neck when you're trying to just do your business. But if something were to go wrong, you as a remote pilot in command have to own that. Again, the captain, you'd have to go down with the ship if you did something that was wrong. You have to accept that. Manned pilots have been accepting that responsibility for years. And unmanned aircraft pilots, remote pilots, you're in the same boat with us now. So one more quiz here. I promise you this is the last one. And I saved this one to the end because probably by this point in the presentation, you guys are thinking about having an alcoholic beverage. It's been a long one, but we're real close to the end here. So regarding alcoholic consumption prior to flight, go ahead and select all that apply. All right, wrapping this up here, we're getting pretty good responses back, but yeah, absolutely. You can't have any drinks within 8 hours of launch. Your blood alcohol content, it's not less than 0.08. Your blood alcohol content has to be less than 0.04. You can't be under the influence. It's not 4 hours, it's 8 hours. And the last one, which got about half the people selecting, which is the before you have to submit your blood alcohol content. We don't have a rule specifically that states that you need to do that, but most states require you when you're operating a vehicle, and I'll tell you in Minnesota they consider a UAS a vehicle, just like an aircraft they consider that a vehicle. You would have to submit to a breathalyzer or blood alcohol test from a law enforcement officer. So if you are approached by a law enforcement officer, that's probably not the best time to try to pretend you have some sort of diplomatic immunity. I would comply with them and work with them on that because I can't speak for every state, but I know certainly in some states, Minnesota included, it's certainly required to do a breathalyzer test. All right, survey to follow. In an email following this webinar, you're going to get a survey. I can't thank you guys enough for sticking around and hanging around. Please fill out that survey. It's like 2 or 3 questions. I just want to get some feedback from you guys, whether or not you thought this was beneficial. Should I do it again? Should I change it up? I'm open to suggestions to make this better for you guys. With that being said, we have about 25 minutes here where we're going to try to do a Q&A. And I will say right off the get-go, I can't answer all your questions that are rolling through. But again, my promise to you is that we will get answers to these questions. It's going to take me a while to hand hack them in. But I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to put everybody's hand down. Just keep them down right now if you could, because I have 230 hands raised and we'll never get to everyone, but keep your hands down. If you have voice capability and you would like to answer a question, I'm going to try to do it that way. What I will do then with the questions that you've typed into the question box, I will attempt to answer, I shouldn't say attempt, I will answer as I go through the week and hopefully get that email distribution out to everyone that registered next week. So if you have the ability to communicate, you've got a mic, you're on the phone, you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to try to get you guys as best I can. The first one I see here, and I apologize if I butcher any names, is Russell Latimer. So Russell, I'm going to unmute you here. I've got your mute, but you should be clear to answer your question. Russell, can you hear me? All right, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm moving on to the next one. The next one I see here is Sheldon Devantier, if I pronounce that correctly. Sheldon, apologies if I don't. But Sheldon, I'm going to take you off mute. Go ahead with your question.
Sorry.
Sheldon, you want to try answering your question again?
Sure. Yeah, sorry about that. I pressed the button by mistake. My bad.
Go ahead with your question.
I was just saying that I pressed the button by mistake. My bad.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you pressed it. All right, no problem. I appreciate that, Sean. I get what you're saying now. I'm 0 for 2, but hey, the night's young. Kelly Williams will be the next one I go here. Kelly, you are off mute. Go ahead with your question.
Hey, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Regarding 107.39 and 49, is there any possibility of getting an onset waiver of liability to operate over actors?
Now, thanks for the question. I'm gonna put you back on mute here, and I don't mean to be rude, but just so we can get to other questions. In terms of liability, that's not something we necessarily waive, but to get a waiver for, I think what you're asking is to operate over actors for film and television production. You can certainly apply for a waiver for operating over people. That's what you'd want to do. You'd want to apply for that waiver to operate over human beings. And depending on what you get with your waiver, you could certainly then quite possibly have a certificate of waiver that allows you to do filming, panoramic shots, flyovers, flybys over people that are not directly involved with the small UAS operation. So what you're looking for would be a certificate of waiver for operating over persons. Excellent. Jumping through the list here, got a lot of hands up. If you don't have a question, please put your hands down so I don't get lost. But the next one here will be Dustin Spencer. Dustin, can you hear me okay? I just lost Dustin, I think. So I'm going to go back here to mute all. And let's try Robert Girodich, if I got that right. Let me just find you here. The screen is jumping around on me. Robert, can you hear me? Nope. All right. Stephen Lee, can you hear me?
What's the name?
Stephen Lee.
Hey, yeah, that's me. I have a question. I got a question about age. The age requirements on a pilot that is operating next to a remote pilot in command.
Under Part 107, we haven't specified an age requirement for somebody manipulating the controls. I guess I would double check. But the remote pilot in command, I believe, would have to be 16 if my numbers are correct. Do me a favor, though, Steve, and put that question, if you haven't already, into the question field so I can do a little bit of research and get you that answer, because I don't have a good one right now for you.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Thank you. And go back on mute and jump into the next one here. John Spaller. John Spaller, can you hear me okay?
Yes, Kevin, you hear me?
Yes, I got you loud and clear.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of confusion about these notifications and the Before You Fly app that the FAA has put out. My friend has 7 airports within 5 miles of his backyard, and if he wants to fly his SUAS in his backyard, he's supposed to call 7 airports. Most of these are unattended grass strips. Is the FAA doing anything about this call before you fly app? It just seems to not be very practical.
Okay, great question. I'll put you back on mute here, John. Thanks for that question. The Before You Fly app was really designed and built for the hobbyist operator. The requirement to notify airports is a hobby rule. Anytime you're going to be within 5 miles of an airport, heliport, seaplane base, you're required to notify either the air traffic facility or the airport operator. That is strictly a hobby rule. Under Part 107, no requirement is required for operating close to those airports, as long as they are not Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or Echo to the surface type airports where we discussed the ATC authorization. Now, to kind of focus a little bit on the hobby side of it, because I think that's where you're going, your buddy's probably just doing this for fun. The app, we got it out there. It can be a lot better, but it's a pretty good start. And I know in certain areas you say, I want to fly here, and the app says, you've got 18 airports within 2 miles. These heliports, these grass strips, these seaplane bases. Unfortunately, I don't have a way around that right now. You're still required to give notification. However, under the hobbyist side, and I'm going to answer this quickly because I want to stay on 107, you can set up a letter of agreement with those airports. So you don't have to simply notify them every single time. You can have the standing letter of agreement so the airports know where you are, where you're operating, how high you go. So that is one option you have on the hobbyist. But I apologize for not going into more detail. I just wanted to keep this a little bit for a commercial. But the Before You Fly app is a great tool, but it's primarily designed for the hobby or recreational operator. Still lots of hands up here. I'm going to go with Zach Gunyon. If I say your last name right, Zach, I hope that's right. Can you hear me?
Hi, I've been attempting to get in contact with several authorized companies that are able to give this certification. However, I have not been able to get in full communication with them. I was wondering if there's any kind of alternatives that I can seek out for this.
All right, just a follow-up question. Zach, who are you trying to get in contact with?
I live in the state of Wyoming, and there's only 2 authorized places where we can actually obtain this test from, and neither of them are getting back in communication with me, and I've also tried to reach out to Utah, however, they're not able to get back with me as well.
Okay, so it's a question of trying to get a hold of a testing center to get your 107 test scheduled?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I'm going to put you back on mute, Zach. Unfortunately, I don't have a way to get around that either. Testing centers are private entities that the FAA gives authorization to administer the tests for. Beyond that, we don't have much control of whether or not they call you back. I can tell you that as of last week, most of the testing centers around the Twin Cities are booked out a month and a half. Obviously, the test is very popular right now, and it's very difficult to get scheduled. And so one of the reasons they might be not calling you back, I don't know for sure, is that they just don't have any room for a long time. But I would hope that they would call you back to at least to let you know. But unfortunately, the only way to take that test is through an authorized testing center. So you do need to find some center that'll work with you on there. I'm sorry you're having a little bit of frustration with that one. Another question coming in, Don Schneider. I'm going to unmute you here. Can you hear me okay, Don?
Yeah, Kevin, can you hear me?
I got you. Go ahead, sir.
Kevin, good seminar. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm wondering if the FAA is going to put any information out to help local law enforcement to know what the rules are, because a lot of them just don't seem to have any idea what the rules are.
Excellent question. Thank you. I'm going to put you back on mute, Don. We have published guidance for law enforcement officers. In fact, we have a kind of a quick reference card that's on our FAA UAS website under resources. So if you go to FAA UAS and on the left-hand side, there's resources. Under that is the law enforcement guidance. We have published it. We just kind of buried it a little bit, so it's not so much in your face on our website. I've been passing the word around to Wisconsin and Minnesota law enforcement agencies and getting them that information. But we do have guidance. We do have information of what we want them to do or what we hope the type of information they would be gathering for us. And that can be found on faa.gov/UAS. On the left-hand side, if my memory serves me correctly, it's under resources, and you'll find the law enforcement guidance under there. So thank you. Good question. We'll go Joey Ferguson. I got you unmuted here, I think. Can you hear me okay? Screen just shifted on me, so I might have missed you, Joey. Sorry about that. Brian Dale.
Unmuted.
Try this. Brian, can you hear me?
Okay, guys, this is the point where Kevin asked me a question. Unfortunately, my computer did not record my microphone input. Basically, what I'm asking him is what is the FAA's position and what are they doing, if anything, to do something about the local governments that are trying to preempt federal law by passing rules that really are not under their purview, such as regulating airspace, because that's the job of the FAA. And this is Kevin's answer coming up.
Great.
Muted.
Question, Brian. Kind of a loaded question here, too. FAA controls airspace, and I think I made that pretty clear in our presentation. States cannot preempt federal law in that regard. They can't say, hey, look at all the airspace above the state of Wyoming up to 100 feet may not have any UASs flying in it. They can't do that. What they can do is enact privacy laws and restrict your ability to take off or land from property they control. And that's what we see a lot of states doing, is that any UAS launch from city property or parks cannot be launched without prior approval, things of that nature. Locally here in Minnesota, I've worked with the state legislature. Fortunately, we have a very, very good Department of Transportation Aeronautics Division in our state, and they are up to speed, and I work in tandem with them a lot. They deal directly with the state legislature far more than I do, so they can be a little bit of a voice. So in my state of Minnesota, we've had pretty good results in working with them, but every state's a little bit different. Not every FAA FISO has somebody like me that's does these types of events, and so we can be lacking in certain areas. So the key is education, but we want to try to do this in a cooperative environment. As I was mentioning, the more people know and the more we want to work together, the more we can educate, the smoother this process will be. But when you've got a city or township that's kind of gone rogue, so to speak, and is saying, any UAS flying above here is subject to arrest and all that stuff, by all means, don't go challenging that, saying you can't do federal rule because you might lose your UAS. I don't want you to go against any sort of enacted law, regardless of whether or not it can be administered constitutionally or preemption or any of that type of stuff. So education is key. I'm certainly trying. I know other offices are trying, and unfortunately we can't reach everybody all at once, but yeah, we're trying to get there. Timothy Ford, I've got you off mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can actually.
Okay, I got you, Tim. Go ahead with your question.
The question I had is in submitting for waivers. Sometimes the mitigation may be in our proprietary company operations manual. So how would we go about submitting that through the website?
So just so I'm going to ask you real quick. So you're concerned about submitting private or proprietary information to the FAA?
Yeah, through the online portal.
Okay.
Under 333, we did it via email.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Thanks. I'm going to put you back on mute, Tim. So when you do your best when you're submitting these the waivers to identify concisely as possible what you're using. And if you identify a proprietary system, let's say by name, we have system ABC software that prevents the UAS from doing this, this, and this. That's probably what I would submit. I wouldn't submit the entire 40-page manual of that proprietary software system. Now, it's fully reasonable that the FAA may call you and say, can you describe this system to me? And you send them, let's say, the information on a separate email. Then you get your approval. Your waiver would be approved with operating in accordance with proprietary system ABC software requirements. So that could be one way to do it. But you're absolutely correct. The online web portal in the description field doesn't lend itself very well to a 80-page PDF document. But being that it's a waiver and not necessarily an exemption, the mitigation could be a little bit more concise for us to review it. If we have additional questions, we'd give you a call and you could come back in. We've got probably another 10 or 13 minutes that I'm going to stick around here. So I've got 55 hands up. I apologize. I won't get to all of you. The next one I'm going to try to get to here is Bill Larned. If I pronounced your last name incorrectly, I apologize, Bill, but can you hear me? Nope. All right, no Bill on that one. Let's try, I'm going to jump down the list here a little bit to try to keep it open to everyone. And let's try Kay Owens. Kay Owens has her hands up. You're off mute, Kay. Can you hear me? Kay, can you hear me? Another dead signal. All right, how about Mike Puckett? Let's try unmuting you. Mike, you're unmuted. Can you hear me?
Hey, how you doing, Kevin?
Good. I got you loud and clear, Mike.
Very good. Great webinar, by the way.
Thank you.
My question is, if I am the remote pilot in command and I hire somebody as a pilot in command, are they eligible to be a pilot if they have a felony record?
So a couple different points you brought up here. Thanks for the question. So there's only one remote pilot in command for the flight. I think what you're asking is if you're the remote pilot in command and you hire a remote pilot to operate your UAS, can they have a felony record? When somebody applies for their airman certificate, that is reviewed by Airman Records and the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA. So if you hired that person because they have a remote pilot certificate, then they've already been through that vetting process. If for some reason that person ended up doing something where they ended up being charged with a felony, that would be something for Airman Records and them to work out. But if the person holds a valid remote pilot certificate, you could certainly hire them either to be the remote pilot in command, or you could be the remote pilot in command and they could fly it however you want. But when they apply for their remote pilot certificate, and if they have a felony record, that's handled directly through Oklahoma City Airman Records and the TSA. So don't really have a good answer for you on would they get one or not. I'm not quite sure on that one. So let's do, is it Kristen Muley? I'm going to try to unmute you. Kristen, can you hear me? Kristen, I got you off mute. Can you hear me? No luck there. So let's try going down. If you've had your question answered, please put your hand down here so I can go on. Jeff Jackson, I've got you off mute. Can you hear me? Boy, just not a lot of luck. Okay, here's what I'm going to do, folks. Apologize if you got your hands up. I'm putting everybody's hands down. We've got 10 minutes to go. Please only raise your hand if you've got capability to communicate via voice. And if you can put your hand back up, I will then start working down the list again. William Reeves, I have got you off of mute. Can you hear me? Actually, no. Hang on one second, William. All right, try this again, William. Have you got me?
My hand's down.
No, your hand is still up. I'll put your hand down. Is this William Reeves?
Yes, it is.
All right, William, I'm putting your hand back down. All right, fantastic. Let's try this again. Everybody's hand is going back down. Raise your hand. I apologize if you've got a good question. All right. Dennis Mayberry, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I've got you, Dennis. Go ahead with your question.
Hot dang. FAA safety. I'm trying to find how we hook up with you to get credits for this. I can't find it anywhere.
Let me pull it up real quick. I'm just going to jump over here. FAA safety. What I'll do is I will give you guys the at least the course number. So
the course number on email didn't work.
Okay. Yep. Hold on here. I had to redo the safety seminar announcement. So 1 second here, and I will pull this up on screen and leave it up.
Hey, Kevin.
And you can see the
register. We can just post our email address. They can send it to us, and we can just put them online.
That'll work too. If you guys can, if you look on the screen here, I'm going to take my pen.
Events, like, because you could have one pilot one day operating on a television show, and then the next day he's going somewhere else, and then another pilot takes over for that same production like a week later. Is there a way to make these waivers and authorizations company specific?
Yeah, great question. So there's absolutely a way to make them company specific, and you can have more than one pilot authorized to use a waiver and more than one pilot authorized to use an authorization. That's outlined in the instructions for applying. Essentially, you're going to need a contact number of whoever is doing it so the ATC can get a hold of them, and that the responsible person has to maintain the list of all the certificated remote pilots and UASs that will be operating underneath that waiver or authorization. Now, they're sort of area specific, certainly for authorization. So if you want to operate in Class Bravo here, Class Delta here, Class Echo here, and Class Delta over there, you're going to need more than just one authorization. You're not going to get one authorization that covers all of those airports. You'll need one for each airport. But certainly you could have more than one pilot utilizing that authorization as long as the responsible person had contact with all those individuals, and the ATC facility had an ability to contact the person utilizing that authorization. All right, jumping on here, Chad Lockoff. If I got your last name right, I'm good for me. But Chad, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I got you loud and clear.
All right. Hey, I work for an oil and gas company. They're requiring us to get these certificates here. I still haven't taken the knowledge portion of this. What do you recommend is a good study guide for that?
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Chad. So there's a lot of different materials out there. Kind of my official answer, the FAA, we produced a study guide which will direct you to the right areas of knowledge that you have to have, and will reference the correct handbooks and materials that you should reference. It's kind of a do-it-yourself study, and it can be one of those things where you start reading into one thing, and next thing you know, you're reading 9,000 pages of FAA handbooks. There are also a lot of private companies out there right now that are offering ground schools. There are a lot of online companies that are offering ground schools, a lot of people that have developed apps, iOS and Android, that are offering ground schools. I don't know if anyone's better than another. I certainly won't take a position of endorsing a particular ground school or app. Kind of buyer beware. Do your research. Ask around before you spend money on anything in life. But certainly when it comes to these ground schools, some of them are pretty good, I've heard. Some of them haven't been so good that I've heard. So there's a lot of different ways to get that knowledge. Doing it on your own and free is one way. Certainly paying for a ground school is another. And I think both would get you to the same point. It just depends on what's more comfortable for you. So good question on that one. George Stowers, I've got you off mute. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You hear me?
I got you loud and clear, George. Go ahead.
Yeah, as currently written, the regs that deal with ops over people and virtual line of sight are fairly subjective and therefore subject to differing interpretations by different pilots and different inspectors. So is there any effort being put in to come up with more objective criteria for what constitutes operations over people and what virtual line of sight might be? You know, I know some countries in Europe say anything more than 500 meters is beyond visual line of sight. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the question. Not to my knowledge are we developing any sort of information or clearer guidance to describe operating over people. Advisory Circular 107-2 deals with it. In fact, it kind of addresses what is operating over people, and it really kind of boils it down to you just can't be over them. What you want to keep in mind, what we're trying to do at the FAA is ensure safety. That's our primary goal. We want to make sure that things that go up in the air are safe and that people on the ground are safe from things that go up in the air. So when it comes to operating over people, I would look at it as, are you over that person? Yes or no? I think that might be a pretty simple answer. Or maybe give another. Yeah?
The last UAS meeting we had last week, that was one of the topics of discussion is what is over a person. And they said the thing to consider is that if a person has their arm out and you can hit that arm, you're too close. If you're directing your energy of your drone towards a crowd of people, and if you lose control of that drone and it hits those people, you're too close. So you can't just say over people. If you have directed energy or energy in motion, it kind of goes back to the days of certifying 133 helicopters carrying 8,000-pound air conditioners underneath the helicopter. If you're in motion and something happens and that thing breaks loose, it's not going to land right underneath the helicopter. It's going to probably land several hundred feet in front of the helicopter. And so therefore, we've got to make sure that the area is clear enough so that it doesn't affect any of those folks on the surface.
Excellent. And that was the point I was going to bring up there. And Jay, you kind of got that. You got that right on the money there.
Yep.
Operating over people seems pretty self-explanatory. And I'm sure George right now is kind of chuckling. He's like, oh, you got two FAA guys here kind of saying two different things. No, we're saying the same thing. So what I was getting at with my little bit of a safety speech was that we want to make sure that if something happens with your UAS and you lose control or it loses power, that it doesn't fall and directly impact somebody. We don't want it hitting anybody in the head, face, or whatever. So obviously, calm air hovering over a crowd, yeah, you're over people. But if there's a 20-knot breeze out of the west and you have a group of people that are to the east of your operation, if you lost power, where would that UAS energy directed go? It would probably sail with the wind into that crowd of people. Could you be considered operating over people at that point? Possibly. A lot of these rules, we haven't had any tests to them because they haven't been issued yet for August 29th, excuse me. So it's tough with that operating over people. Now, the second part was operating beyond visual line of sight. We are moving towards FAA as a whole performance-based qualifications, I guess is maybe a way to say it. When we talked about that waiver, and I said, here's your performance-based issues, and you had to do all that stuff, or putting lights on the aircraft for night operations. We don't have specifications. We just say, got to see it from 3 miles. So in terms of visual line of sight, with unaided eye, other than corrective lenses, meaning no binoculars, no telescopes, you have to be able to see that UAS as a remote pilot in command, period. If you look at it and you tell me you can see that beyond 500 meters, okay, that's your visual line of sight. It's up to you. The burden's on the remote pilot in command to be in compliance with the regs. If you're flying it 2 miles away and you're telling me you can still see it, yeah, I don't know. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But the burden's upon you. It's a performance-based deal. So if you can see it, it's within visual line of sight. We don't have any specifics on that.
Just one thing to add to that, Kevin. They're working right now up in North Dakota with the Hermes aircraft. They've been working actually for over a year now, trying to get it so that they can use the heads-up hoods that people use or use other than line of sight, so that you can use a video controller or a cell phone, that type of thing, so you don't have to actually physically see the drone. Those guidelines and everything that they're developing up here with the Hermes are all bending towards the rulemaking that's going to allow you guys to do more flying without having to see it. Because the technology is there, it's just nobody's tested it.
Yeah, and I want to cut you off there, Jay, for a minute. FPV wasn't something I wanted to discuss because it's a little bit of a hot topic right now, and I don't have a good answer. Certainly, Jay, in Fargo, where he works out of their part of the Grand Forks U.S. testing site, one of the 6, I believe, in the U.S., certainly working on technologies like that. But for the rule as it sits now, the Part 107 doesn't allow FPV unless you get some sort of waiver for visual line of sight, and even then, I don't think it would be allowing FPV. I don't want to get into it more than that because I don't have a good answer. I don't want to lead you guys astray. So we'll stay on the topic for VLOS. A couple more questions. Then we'll wrap it up. Ben Bell, if you're still with me, I've got you off mute.
Hey, Kevin, can you hear me?
Yes, I got you, Ben.
Hey, I got a quick question. I have my 333 exception and just got my UAS airman certificate. What is the FAA doing about kind of the rogue pilots that are popping up on Craigslist and popping up all over who are doing things commercially for money? Like every car commercial I see these days has aerial shots. Is the FAA doing anything to kind of to stop this or police it or anything in that matter?
All right, great question, Ben. And I'm surprised it wasn't one of the first ones I clicked on because that's something. We don't have enough people to hide in the shadows and the bushes to catch UAS. So an operation of a UAS that is not in compliance with the regulations of Part 107, pretty much everything that Ben just described there is an operation not in compliance and is no less dangerous than any other regulatory non-compliance. The trick is for us to be able to conduct enforcement on that. Up to 107 becoming active, it was a roundabout way of enforcing a rule. People like to say, well, the FAA didn't have any rules. We've always had rules. They weren't just in-your-face rules like people were used to with Part 91 or Part 135. And it was very difficult for us to maneuver through that process. Now with Part 107, it becomes very clear-cut. Either you were or you weren't. And I would expect that as we move on, these rogue operators, as you point out, these people doing it illegally, are going to be caught. Either they're going to be turned in by other people, or they just simply won't be given business anymore because the people contracting them will realize that they're not authorized to do what they're doing. They could be liable for a whole bunch of different stuff under that case under civil law. But in terms of FAA inspectors, we follow up on every potential illegal UAS operation we're notified of. There is nothing that rolls into our inbox here. I'm speaking for the Minneapolis FSDO, and I'm probably speaking for all FSDOs. There's nothing that rolls into our inbox advising us of a potential illegal operation that's not followed up on. We follow up on every one. In fact, we have a specific enforcement and compliance team dedicated in headquarters to working these if they get to that portion, if they get to the enforcement portion. So absolutely we're concerned about it. Absolutely we're following up on it. Absolutely it's difficult to do, but that doesn't make it any less important. So yes, we are following up on that. It's just we're a little bit outnumbered right now, but it doesn't mean that we won't follow up on everyone. So thanks for that question. All right, last question goes to Brian Cherry. Brian, are you with me? Uh-oh, Brian's going to lose it.
Can you hear me now?
I got you now, Brian. You just made it under the wire.
Oh, yeah, the mic was muted. Hey, thanks for hosting this. It's a great webinar.
Thank you.
My question is about people shooting down authorized or certificated operators with a registered aircraft. And how come there's been no action taken by the FAA to date on any of these shooters?
Okay, thanks, Brian. Can I punt and say that this is one of those ongoing legal issues that I don't want to answer? Okay, let me try to give you at least a little bit of an answer. Shooting down a drone, you're shooting down an aircraft. I spent the better part of the first part of this presentation telling you that UAS are aircraft. So you knock one out of the sky with a shotgun, you shot at an aircraft. Typically, the way that firing upon an aircraft works is it's handled by the FBI. It's an FBI event. It's similar to somebody threatening a flight crew or something like that, of that nature. We are concerned about it. We are wholly against it. Most state and local municipalities or authorities will tell you that it's flat out illegal to do that, private property, whatever, what have you. So absolutely we're concerned about it. It's just, it may not be getting the press that you would want it to get. And that may be a result of, we have to do everything based on risk. And if we have a particular operation over here that's a higher risk, we have to devote personnel resources to that, and we can't get to this other area that's another risk, shooting down the drone or something like that. It's a tough question for me to answer. It's one I definitely want to not answer. And maybe I've done that with what I just said, my rambling thought to you. But we are concerned with shooting down aircraft. It is not okay to do that. They are traditionally, those events are investigated by the FBI. I have worked events where people have said they're going to go out and shoot at an aircraft because it was flying over their house. Not a drone, but a manned aircraft. Our first step is to contact the FBI, and the FBI and local authorities go out and take care of that. So we are concerned with it. It may not be getting the press you would expect it to get, and it may appear like we're not doing anything, but I don't believe that to be the case. So it's 10:18 on the East Coast, 9:18 here Central Time. I'm at the end of my webinar. In fact, I'm about 20 minutes beyond that. So let me just kind of wrap up here and say thank you to everyone that tuned in and stuck with us the entire time. I am going to take this recording. As far as I know, it did record, and I'm going to try to produce it. If I can produce it and post it online, what we'll do is we'll take the registration email list, all 900 plus of you that registered, many that couldn't attend, and I will send out another notification to all of you, and you will get an opportunity to view that email. Or excuse me, to view the presentation. I also know some people have probably recorded this anyway, and it may end up on YouTube, and that's, it kind of is what it is. I don't have anything to say you can't do that. But my goal is to have it produced back up online. Again, one last time with the questions that are rolling in, You guys asked some great questions over the voice line. I know you've got equally awesome questions here in the question box. We will get to them all. If there's 700 questions, please give me some time to answer all 700 questions. So you're going to get that survey in your inbox after the seminar is complete here. Thank you for attending. Please fill out the survey if you liked it. I would appreciate knowing if you didn't like it. Let me know. And I would like to do this again in the future because I think it might have helped out a lot of you guys. So good night. Thank you all for attending. I want to say special thanks to Jay Flowers out of Fargo FSDO, to Aaron Sykes, my safety rep up here in Minnesota, a UAS operator, for hanging there with me and kind of running the production side. I couldn't have done it without you guys. So thanks, everyone. Have a good night. We'll wrap up the presentation here.
Thanks, Kevin.